Ethan Marsh came to his senses at the sound of a scream. Someone was shaking him by the shoulder and demanding that he do something. His vision was blurry. He was lying on dirty straw, in a body that wasn't his own, and wearing clothes that weren't his. A crowd had gathered around him. The air smelled of blood and smoke. On a wooden table in the middle of the square lay a man in a torn cart driver's jacket. He was pinned down by an overturned cart. The man's stomach was swollen and turning blue. Standing nearby was a man in a white cassock with a golden sun on his chest. His palms glowed with a warm light. The light streamed down onto the cart driver's body, and the wound on his side was closing right before their eyes. The skin was healing smoothly and cleanly. The crowd murmured approvingly. Ethan watched this and couldn't believe his eyes. Just an hour ago, he had been a surgeon at the clinic, finishing a 40-hour shift. Then there had been a flash of light in the doctor's office, followed by darkness. Now he was lying in the square of an unfamiliar city with wooden houses, watching real magic unfold. The man in the robe withdrew his hands and announced that the healing was complete. The crowd applauded. The cart driver didn't move. His face had turned gray. Ethan stood up. His body didn't respond well. It was younger and weaker than his own. Fragments of someone else's memory surfaced in his mind. His name was Deerinholt. He was 22 years old. He had been expelled from the abode of light for lacking the gift. He had been starving for 3 days. Ethan realized all this in a matter of seconds and pushed it aside. None of that mattered now. What mattered was that the man on the table was dying. Ethan could tell by the color of his skin and the way his cheeks were sunken. He pushed the onlookers aside and approached the table. He placed his fingers on the cart driver's neck. The pulse was rapid and thread-like. His abdomen was hard as a board. Ethan understood everything at once. The cart had crushed the driver's spleen. The Lightbringer had sealed the skin shut, and inside, the man continued to bleed out. His beautiful, smooth skin was the lid on a coffin. Ethan said that this man would die in 10 minutes unless his abdomen was opened. The crowd fell silent. The Lightbringer turned and gave him a piercing look. He recognized the expelled disciple and smirked. He said that a talentless beggar had no place standing beside a miracle of healing. He said the wound was closed, and the man was simply asleep. Ethan replied that the man was not asleep. The man is dying of internal bleeding. Blood is pouring into his abdominal cavity from a ruptured spleen. The Lightbringer frowned. He didn't know those words. At that moment, the cart driver began to wheeze. His body arched. A woman in the crowd screamed that it was her husband and that they had 4 children. Ethan waited no longer. He grabbed a narrow knife from the butcher's counter and plunged it into a pot of boiling soup over the fire. Then he shouted at the woman to bring some strong wine and a clean cloth. The Lightbringer tried to push him away. Ethan looked him in the eye and said that if the man were to die, he would die in the Lightbringer's arms. And if the Lightbringer stopped him, the widow would tell the whole town exactly who had forbidden the rescue. The Lightbringer took a step back. The crowd closed in around the table. Ethan doused his hands in wine up to his elbows. He doused the knife. He slid open the cart driver's shirt across his stomach. Someone in the crowd gasped. Someone said the boy had gone mad and wanted to slaughter the dying man. Ethan didn't listen. He ran the knife across the skin confidently and quickly. 20 years of surgeries had made his hands smarter than his fear. Dark blood gushed from the incision. The crowd recoiled. A woman covered her mouth with her hands. Ethan worked. He scooped out the blood and searched for the source. His fingers found the crushed spleen. He clamped off the vascular pedicle. The bleeding stopped. He demanded a needle and the thinnest thread or string. The old apothecary handed him a curved needle and waxed thread used for sewing wineskins. Ethan tied off the vessels. He removed what remained of the spleen. He checked the other organs. The liver was intact. The intestines were intact. He rinsed the cavity with a mixture of wine and boiled water from the cauldron and began to sew, stitch after stitch. The crowd stood in dead silence. People watched as a beggar boy rummaged around inside the belly of a living man, and for some reason, no one dared to stop him. When the last stitch was placed, the cart driver's breathing evened out. The pallor faded from his face, and at that moment, a sound rang out in Ethan's head, pure and clear as the chime of a crystal bell. A translucent window of blue light unfolded before his eyes. No one around him could see it. Lines formed of their own accord. The medical system welcomed its host. The system reported that it had been created for a world where the art of healing had died. The system reported that the first patient saved had been recorded. The severity of the case was high. The reward was unlocked. The level 1 diagnostic gaze ability. Ethan blinked. The world around him changed. He looked at the cart driver and saw a faint outline of his body through his skin. The sutured blood vessels glowed and even green. There was no inflammation. He looked at the woman standing nearby and saw a cloudy spot in her right lung, a sign of a chronic illness. He looked at the Lightbringer and saw a healthy body and a heart beating wildly. Brother Calum, the Lightbringer, looked at the breathing cart driver, and on his face appeared something Ethan had never seen in anyone, ever. It was the horror of a man whose worldview had crumbled before his very eyes. For 20 years, Calum had been healing wounds and considered that the pinnacle of what was possible. Now he saw that beneath the skin lay an entire world about which he knew nothing. He asked quietly and hoarsely how the exiled disciple knew what was inside a person. Ethan wiped his hands and replied that the body was not a mystery of the gods, but a mechanism. A mechanism can be studied. A malfunction can be found and repaired. Light closes the door, but does not fix what is broken beyond it. Kaleem remained silent. The crowd began to murmur. People approached and touched the sleeping cart driver. A woman fell to her knees and kissed Ethan's hands. He helped her up and told her that her husband must not be moved for 3 days, and that the wound must be kept clean. An apothecary named Garvin looked at Ethan with narrowed eyes, chewing his lips. Then he said he had a spare back room in his shop, and that the young man's hands were in the right place. Ethan agreed without hesitation. He needed a roof over his head and a place to work. The crowd began to disperse and spread the story throughout the city. By evening, all of Windhall was talking about the penniless apprentice who had cut open a dead man and brought him back to life. People argued. Some called it a miracle. Others recalled a word that was spoken only in whispers in the kingdom of Solaran. That word was heresy. To cut into living flesh was to encroach upon the design of the light. So taught the order. That very night, Brother Callum sat in his cell, staring at a blank sheet of paper. He was supposed to write a report to the abode about blasphemy. The pen dipped toward the paper 3 times and paused 3 times. Before his eyes stood the gray face of the cart driver, whom he had declared healed. For the first time in his life, Callum did not know whose side the truth was on. Meanwhile, in the back room of the apothecary, by candlelight, Ethan was studying the system's windows. The system displayed an experience bar and a list of locked abilities. The names were smudged, but he could make out words about purity, steel, and painless sleep. The system reported that every person saved unlocked something new. The more difficult the case, the more generous the reward. Ethan leaned back on the straw mattress and, for the first time in 2 days, felt solid ground beneath his feet. He didn't know how he'd ended up here, nor did he know if there was a way back. But he knew one craft, and no one here knew that craft. In the city beyond the pharmacy's walls, thousands of people were dying from appendicitis, tumors, and hernias. They were called the Cursed and were given funeral rites while still alive. For him, these were just ordinary days in the operating room. He closed his eyes and was almost asleep when someone pounded on the pharmacy door with a fist. A voice from outside shouted that the city guard demanded entry. The guards had come for the man who had cut open a person in the square. Garvin shuffled toward the door and turned to look at Ethan. Ethan sat down on the mattress and realized that the first life he'd saved had already come back to haunt him. Garvin opened the door, and 3 guards, led by a sergeant, entered the pharmacy. The sergeant was broad-shouldered and weary. He said there was a rumor going around town that the man who had slashed a living person in the square was hiding here. He said that slashing people was prohibited by law and by the Order's charter. Ethan stepped into the candlelight and calmly replied that he hadn't slashed the man. He'd saved him. The difference was that the man was alive. The sergeant scratched the back of his head. He clearly wasn't eager to arrest anyone. He said that the complaint had been filed not by the victim, but by the Abode of Light, and that, according to the rules, he was obligated to take the carver in for questioning. At that moment, the diagnostician's gaze drifted involuntarily toward the sergeant, and Ethan saw in his right hand a misaligned fracture and an infected abscess under the nail of his thumb. The finger was swollen and twitching with pain. Ethan said that the sergeant hadn't slept for 4 nights because his finger was throbbing and the pain radiated all the way to his elbow. The sergeant froze. He asked how the young man knew that. Ethan replied that he could tell such things by the color of the skin and the way a person protected his hand. He offered the sergeant a deal. He would take away the pain right now, and in return, the sergeant would report that the carver would await questioning at the pharmacy under the supervision of the venerable Garvin, rather than in a cold pit. The sergeant didn't hesitate for long. Pain speaks louder than regulations. Ethan sat him down at the table. He heated a thin knife over the fire. He rubbed it with Garvin's strong tincture. With a single motion, he lanced the abscess at the base of the nail. The sergeant hissed and exhaled immediately. The pressure was gone and the pain went with it. Ethan applied a bandage with honey ointment and ordered it to be changed twice a day. The sergeant wiggled his finger and stared at Ethan like a child watching a magician. As he left, he told the guards that the suspect was under house arrest and that the case could wait. That's how Ethan bought himself some time. In the morning, the system chimed and reported that the saved finger had been credited, a minor case. The reward was small but useful, a level 1 pure field ability. Ethan held his palm out over the table and felt an invisible wave emanate from it. The system explained that within the field's boundaries, the invisible rot that causes infection is destroyed. Ethan laughed out loud. Sterilization on demand. Here, it was worth more than gold. Garvin decided the tenant had lost his mind. Over the next few days, the back room of the pharmacy turned into an emergency room. The first to arrive was the cart driver with his wife. The diagnostician's examination showed that the stitches were holding and the wound was healing cleanly. The cart driver's neighbors followed suit. Ethan lanced abscesses. He set dislocations. He pulled a fish bone out of a boy's throat. He showed a midwife how to turn a baby in the womb. He charged whatever people could afford, and he didn't charge the poor at all. Garvin grumbled that the clinic would ruin the pharmacy, yet he beamed because sales of ointments and tinctures had tripled. The system dripped with experience and unlocked the second level of the gaze. Now Ethan could see not only organs, but also the flow of blood. In the evenings, he drew. He recalled anatomical atlases and traced them with charcoal onto cheap paper. The structure of the heart, the course of the major blood vessels, the arrangement of the abdominal organs. Garvin looked at the drawings and crossed himself with the sign of the sun. He said that for pictures like these, the order would burn people without asking their names. Ethan replied that because of ignorance of these drawings, the city buried 10 people a week. On the 7th day, the merchant Tolman Bray was carried into the apothecary. Tolman belonged to the city's first guild. He was carried by 4 servants, while the family's personal physician ran behind them, wringing his hands. The merchant screamed and doubled over in pain. The physician lamented that his master had been struck by the curse of the rotten belly and that 3 light bearers had been pouring light all night, but the light had not helped. Ethan laid the merchant on the table and cast a glance that revealed to him what he had seen 1,000 times in his past life: a swollen, inflamed appendix, ready to burst, hours until rupture. Then, pus throughout the abdominal cavity and death within 2 days, which they would call here the will of the light. Ethan declared that there was no curse. There was a diseased appendix. It had to be removed immediately. The family physician flew into a rage. He shouted that no one would allow the city's leading merchant to be cut open, and that the boy would pay with his head. Between his fits, Tolman rasped out the question of whether he would survive without the knife. Ethan answered honestly, without the knife, he would die before tomorrow's sunset. With the knife, he had a good chance of living to old age. Tolman was a merchant. He'd spent his whole life weighing risks. He ordered the doctor to shut up and told the servants to do whatever the surgeon said. Ethan spread out the clean cloth over the table. He washed his hands up to his elbows. He laid out the sterilized instruments. There was no anesthesia, so he put a leather strap between the merchant's teeth and gave him Garvin's poppy decoction. The servants held him down. Ethan cut quickly. An oblique incision in the right iliac region. The appendix emerged crimson and swollen, bandaging the base. Resection, treatment of the stump, rinsing, suture. The entire operation took less than half an hour. Tolman lost consciousness halfway through, and that was a mercy. The personal physician looked at the removed appendix in a clay bowl. For 40 years, he had served the city's wealthy families. He had seen how this filth killed people and had always thrown up his hands and spoken of a curse. Now the curse lay in the bowl, a small piece of rotten flesh that could simply be removed. The physician sat down on a bench next to another bench. Garvin took him by the elbow. On the evening of the 3rd day, Tolman Bray was eating broth and dictating letters. A week later, he walked into the apothecary on his own 2 feet. He placed a purse of gold on the table and said that the life of the city's foremost merchant was worth more, but he would pay for the rest in a different way. He would pay with his word. and Tolman Bray's word reverberated through the guilds. The system recognized it as a severe case and unlocked the ability Thin Thread. In Ethan's palm, a spool of suture material, thinner than a hair and stronger than a sinew, wove itself from blue light. The material dissolved on its own within the body. Ethan nearly shed a tear. Things were going well, and according to all the rules of this world, that was precisely why they were bound to go wrong. The blow came a day later. A herald from the Lightbearers Guild appeared at the pharmacy with a document on stamped paper. The guild declared that Deerenholt, a resident of the city, possessed neither a gift nor a title, and therefore his practice of medicine was deemed an illegal trade. The fine was 50 silver crowns for every patient treated. A repeat offense would be referred to the abode's court. Garvin read the document, his hands trembling. He said the guild would crush them with fines within a week. Ethan reread the document twice. He noted that the document prohibited the practice, that is, charging a fee. There was not a word in the document about providing free care. Ethan examined the Baron right there in the carriage by the light of a street lamp. The third-level diagnostician's vision had opened up just the day before and now revealed the tissues in fine detail. The tumor was embedded in the fatty layer and muscle. To surface, the edges were smooth and the capsule was intact. It hadn't invaded deeper tissues and blood flow around it was unobstructed. Ethan exhaled, benign. He told the Baron that the growth could be removed in its entirety, and that surgery should be performed in the coming days before it grew deeper. The Baron asked about his chances. Ethan replied that if the Baron survived the night after the knife wound, he'd be dancing at the winter feast. The Baron snorted and said that the last time he'd danced was at his own wedding, and even then, only under duress. The operation was scheduled to take place at the Baron's residence in 2 days. The next morning, a boy from the harbor district ran into the pharmacy. He was barefoot and ashen with fear. He said that in the neighborhood by the canal, people were burning from the inside. 11 people had already died. The light bearers had cordoned off the neighborhood and were praying, but people were still dying. Ethan grabbed his bag and followed the boy. Garvin ran after them with a basket of tinctures. The harbor district greeted them with a smell that Ethan recognized before he even saw the sick. That's what rotten water and disaster smell like. The poor people's houses stood along the canal. In the very first house, 3 people lay on the floor. Fever, delirium, bloody diarrhea. The diagnostician's examination revealed inflamed intestines and the familiar picture of a severe intestinal infection. Ethan passed through 4 more houses and saw the same thing everywhere. Then he stepped out to the canal and understood everything. Upstream, the slaughterhouse's sewage ditch had burst, and the waste was flowing directly into the canal. And the district drew water from the canal for drinking and cooking. There was only one well in the square, and the line to get water from it took an hour, so people were drawing water from the canal. Brother Ion, the neighborhood's light bearer, greeted Ethan with hostility. He said this was punishment for the port's sins, and that the light purified the souls of the dying. Ethan asked how many people had died in the past 3 days. Iona replied that 7 had died, and that it was all the will of the light. Ethan said that the will of the light had nothing to do with it. People were drinking water contaminated with rot from the slaughterhouse. This rot is alive and invisible. It enters through the mouth and burns the intestines from within. Iona's light seals the sores in the intestines, which is why Iona's patients live 1 day longer than those without any help at all. But as long as people drink that same water, the rot enters faster than Iona can burn it out. Iona opened his mouth and closed it. He was nearly 50, and he'd spent his whole life watching the poor die. Talk of invisible rot was heresy. But in these words, the neighborhood's demise was taking shape as a clear picture for the first time. Ethan didn't wait for the light bearer to process the collapse of the world. He went to see the neighborhood elder. Chief Corvus was a burly former longshoreman with a broken nose. He listened to Ethan with his arms crossed. He said he knew all those tales. Every smart aleck comes along and talks about punishment and sins, while people die like flies. Ethan replied that he didn't need the chief's faith. He needed 10 cauldrons, all the firewood in the neighborhood, and 10 strong women, and the paths leading down to the canal had to be blocked. If people didn't stop dying in 3 days, let the sergeant drown him in that very canal. Corvus looked him in the eyes for a long time. Then he said the cauldrons would be ready by noon. Then the battle began. Ethan organized it like a military operation. The paths leading down to the canal were blocked with carts, and boys were stationed to blow whistles at any intruders. The cauldrons were set up in the square, and water boiled in them day and night. Only boiled water was allowed to be drunk. A separate house was turned into a hospital barracks, and all the sick were taken there. The floors were washed with lye. The patient's rags were burned. Ethan ordered the healthy people to wash their hands before eating and after using the outhouse, and he placed a barrel of boiled water and ash by the barracks. Garvin brewed a decoction of bark and astringent herbs right there on the spot. The sick were given the decoction to drink spoonful by spoonful, salted, boiled water with honey. Ethan knew that with intestinal infections, it is not the rot itself that kills, but the dehydration of the body, and he forced the sick to drink the water through clenched teeth. Brother Ion followed him around in silence on the first day. On the second day, he stood silently beside him and began to direct the light toward the most severely ill patients, as Ethan instructed. Ethan showed him whom to treat with light first, and Iona did so. The light sealed the bleeding sores, while the water and the decoction did the rest. It was the first alliance of knife and light in Saloran's history, and it worked better than either the knife or the light alone. On the third day, one man died, an old man who had been brought in too late. No one else died. On the fifth day, half the barracks were sitting around begging for food. Corvus went to the cauldrons in the square and stared for a long time at the line for boiled water. Then he took a ladle, drank his fill, and wiped his mouth. He said loudly, so the whole square could hear, that in 30 years at the port he'd seen 4 plagues, and each one had taken half a block. This one had taken 8. He turned to Ethan and bowed at the waist, and the entire block by the cauldrons bowed in unison. The system in his head sang, "Mass rescue. 43 patients accounted for. The steel set activated." In Ethan's hands, a full surgical set coalesced from light and took on its full weight. Scalpels, clamps, forceps, a needle holder, retractors, a bone saw. The steel was mirror-like and neither dulled nor rusted. The system added that the instruments were visible to everyone and therefore the bearer should come up with an explanation for them. Ethan told Garvin that he had traded for the set with a visiting craftsman from the south. Garvin looked at the mirror-like steel and said that there were no such craftsmen in the south, and that he was an old man who didn't want to know anything. 2 days later, Ethan operated on the Baron, in a clean room in the Baron's house by a dozen candles, with the pure field above the table, poppy decoction, a belt between his teeth, 40 minutes of work. The tumor came out whole, encased in a capsule. The thin thread lay in 3 layers. The Baron cursed through the strap so fiercely that the candles trembled, but by morning he was sleeping like a child. A week later, he stepped out before his retinue for a review and raised his sword above his head. The retinue roared with cheers, and Ethan sat by his bedside that last evening, listening to the reason the Baron had undertaken all of this. The Baron spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. He said that the carver had saved the quarter, the merchant, and himself, and that now no one in Windhall would hand the carver over to the order. But that was precisely why a man from the Abbey had already set out from the capital of Lumendor. Not just any brother, Oswin, the Inquisitor for matters of heresy. The very same Oswine who, 12 years ago, had sent the herbalist from Westmore to the stake along with her apprentices. The Baron said he would hide the carver on his lands and buy time, but Oswine has a letter bearing the seal of the Supreme Hierarch, Severin, and by virtue of this letter, he can demand the extradition of any commoner. There is only one authority higher than that of the Hierarch's letter, the Royal Palace. And at that, the Baron fell silent and looked at Ethan strangely. He said that news was coming from the capital. Vague, but reliable news. The heir to the throne, Princess Hilaria, was fading away. The kingdom's finest light-bearers infused her with light 3 times a day, and the light seeped away from her like water into sand. King Aldemar was old and had no other children. The Baron said he did not know what was causing the princess to waste away, but he knew that the man who could save her would be able to slay even the hierarch himself in the town square, and people would cheer him on. Ethan listened, and the diagnostician's gaze automatically scanned the darkness outside the window, as if trying to reach the capital. And a day later, a detachment in white cloaks bearing a golden sun appeared on the northern road. Investigator Oswin rode into Baron Redgar's lands a week earlier than expected, and his first stop was neither the castle nor the apothecary. He headed to the harbor district to see Brother Iona, the only Lightbringer who had seen everything with his own eyes, and who, according to the Order's charter, was not permitted to lie to the investigator even once. Oswin interrogated Iona for 4 hours. Ethan learned of this from Corvus's boys, who were perched on the fence of the House of Prayer like sparrows. Iona emerged from the interrogator's chambers as pale as his cassock and walked through the quarter without looking at anyone. And the next morning, the Abbey's heralds read the decree in all of Windhall's squares. Interrogator Oswin, in the name of the Supreme Hierarch Severin, announced a public trial of faith. In 3 days on Cathedral Square, a man calling himself the physician, Darren Holt, must appear before the court of light and answer for cutting open living flesh, for denying punishment, and for invisible rot. Failure to appear is tantamount to an admission of heresy. Harboring a heretic is tantamount to heresy. That last line was a direct jab at the Baron. Garvin read the list of charges, his lips twitching. He said they had to flee south by sea and that Tolman would provide a ship. Ethan remained silent, lost in thought. Fleeing meant that everything they had accomplished would go up in smoke. The cauldrons in the square would grow cold. People would drink from the canal again, the ion would be destroyed, and a tale would spread across the land about a woodcarver who fled because he was guilty. He told Garvin that he would go to the square. Garvin called him a suicide and left, slamming the door, but returned an hour later with a basket of food because he was old and lonely and had no other fool like him. Baron Redgar sent his steward that night. The Baron conveyed that his retinue would be in the square to maintain order and that he would not hand the woodcarver over to be burned alive, but against the hierarch's decree, he was be compelled in court. The court itself would decide everything, and Oswin's court had never lost a case. For 3 days, Ethan prepared not for speeches. He saw patients from morning until nightfall because the line at the pharmacy stretched halfway across town. People came to be treated and came simply to touch his sleeve. Rumors of the trial had drawn half the county to Windhall. By the 3rd morning, the cathedral square was so packed that the guards could barely keep the passage clear. Oswin sat on a dais under a white canopy. He was gaunt and calm, with the face of a man who had long since decided everything about everyone. To his right sat the elders of the Guild of Lightbearers. To his left stood an empty dock for the accused. Baron Redgar sat below the platform with a stony expression, and his retinue stood at the edges of the square. Ethan stepped out of the crowd alone, dressed in simple, clean clothes, with a doctor's bag slung over his shoulder. Oswin began without preamble. His voice was soft, yet audible in every corner of the square. He asked whether the accused had cut into the living flesh of a human being. Ethan replied that he had, and that the man in question was standing in the crowd and could show the scar. Oswin asked whether the accused claimed that the plague in the harbor was caused not by a curse, but by rot in the water. Ethan replied that he had claimed this, and still did. Oswin asked whether the accused acknowledged that the doctrine of invisible rot was absent from the Book of Light. Ethan replied that the Book of Light also lacked any mention of horseshoes and mills, yet horseshoes hold and mills grind. A ripple of laughter swept through the crowd. Oswin's expression did not change. He raised his hand and said that it was useless to weigh words, and therefore the light would judge by deeds. He gave a signal, and a stretcher was carried onto the platform. A child lay on the stretcher, a girl of about 7, waxy skin, a pointed nose. Oswin announced that she was the daughter of a goldsmith from the Abbey's caravan. Yesterday, she had fallen from a horse. 3 brothers of the abode had poured light into her all night, but the light did not remain within her. Oswin turned to Ethan and said that if the carver's teaching was true, then let the carver save the child here and now before the eyes of the light and the people. And if the child died under his knife, then the teaching would die as well, and the carver himself would ascend to the pyre for the child's death. The square gasped and fell silent. It was a trap forged by a master. Oswin did not know what was happening to the child, nor did he want to know. To him, the dying child was a millstone around the heretic's neck. The girl's public death at the carving knife's hand would bury the carver more surely than any sentence. Refusal would bury him just as surely. Ethan was no longer listening. He stood by the stretcher, and the diagnostician's gaze pierced through the waxy skin. He ruled out a ruptured spleen immediately. It was worse. Blood was pooling beneath the skull. A ruptured vessel beneath the temporal bone was bleeding inward, and the hematoma was pressing on the brain. The girl's pupils were uneven. The right one was wider than the left. Her breathing was faltering. Every minute counted, and in his former world, this would have been a case for neurosurgery and trepanation. Here, there was a platform, a crowd, and an interrogator waiting for him to fail. Ethan straightened up and spoke loudly so the entire square could hear. The child is dying because blood has pooled beneath the skull and is pressing on the brain. I will drill into the bone and drain the blood. If the abode wishes to help, let Brother Iona stand beside me and hold the child with light while the steel works." The square buzzed like a beehive, drilling into a child's head. Windhall had never heard of such a thing. Oswin allowed himself a smile and gave his approval with a nod. He was certain he was witnessing a suicide. Iona stepped out of the abode's ranks without looking at the interrogator and stood by the stretcher. From then on, Ethan's world narrowed to the square of the child's head, a clean field, a shaved temple, a strong potion poured into slightly parted lips. The steel set rested on the white cloth, and the mirror-like steel glinted across the entire surface. Ethan marked the spot based on the swelling and the difference in the pupils. The hand drill from the set fit into his palm like a glove. He cut through the skin. He pushed the periosteum aside. The drill bit sank into the bone. The crowd stood in such silence that the screech of steel could be heard. Iona held his palms against the girl's chest, and his light flowed steadily, steadying her breath and heartbeat. The bone gave way. Ethan extracted the bone ring, and dark blood spurted from the hole. He gently removed the clot. He located the bleeding vessel. The thin thread tied it off in 2 loops. He could see the pressure subsiding and the brain settling back into its socket. Ethan sealed the opening in the bone with the bone ring. He sewed on a flap of skin. He applied a bandage, and then the girl took a deep, steady breath. Then she opened her eyes and wept aloud from fear and pain, and the crowd erupted in such a roar that the jackdaws took flight from the cathedral. People wept and embraced one another. The goldsmith crawled on his knees toward the platform. The Baron's retainers bellowed as if storming a fortress. Baron Redgar stood, pounding the railing with his fist and laughing. Oswin sat motionless. He wasn't looking at the girl. He was looking at Ethan, and in his calm eyes, for the first time, there was something that Ethan could read without any system. It wasn't confusion. It was cold calculation. Oswin was reclassifying the heretic from the category of madmen to that of a threat to the state. He rose and announced in an even voice that the light had shown mercy through unworthy hands and that the trial was postponed until the supreme hierarch had spoken. It was a retreat, and everyone in the square understood it. The system rang incessantly, salvation in the presence of over 5,000 witnesses. A special reward, the ability to experience painless sleep. Ethan read the description and his throat tightened. An induced sleep with a complete absence of pain lasting up to 2 hours, anesthesia, real anesthesia. He'd been performing surgeries in this world using nothing but a belt and poppy decoction, and now he finally had what mattered most. That same evening, 3 people knocked on the pharmacy door. Baron Redgar entered first. Behind him was a man in travel clothes without any coats of arms, but with a bearing that couldn't be hidden. The third to enter was an old man with a scroll tucked under his arm. The man with the distinguished bearing unrolled the scroll, from which hung a large seal of red wax bearing the royal sun and crown. He introduced himself as a chamberlain of His Majesty Aldamar's court and said he had ridden from Lumendor for 6 days. News of the physician who could see inside the body had reached the palace earlier, along with a letter from Tolman Bry to his partners in the capital. The Chamberlain said he would be brief because there was absolutely no time to spare. The heir to the throne, Princess Hilaria, was dying. The court's healers were powerless and had spent the past week merely alleviating her pain. The king was summoning the physician Darren Holt to the court immediately. The Chamberlain paused and added quietly that he would say one thing on his own behalf. The carriages are waiting, and the horses will be changed at every station, because according to the palace physician's estimates, the princess has about 10 days left to live. They set out before dawn. 2 carriages and 10 mounted guards. Garvin tagged along with a chest of tinctures and declared that at his age, it would be foolish to die in a warm bed. The Baron assigned 4 of his finest men to accompany them, and as they parted, he squeezed Ethan's shoulder and said that if the smell of a bonfire reached the palace, the physician should remember that Windhall stands firm and its walls are thick. The journey took 5 days instead of 7. They changed horses at every station. Ethan slept fitfully and spent the rest of the time pressing the Chamberlain for every detail about the princess's illness. The picture that emerged was grim. Ilaria was 19. The illness had been going on for 2 years. At first, there was fatigue and paleness. Then came stomach pains after meals. After that, the princess began to waste away. She ate, yet continued to waste away. In recent months, she had been vomiting in the mornings, and the pain had settled beneath her right ribs and in her back. Light relieved the pain for a few hours, and that was all. Her skin had turned yellow over the past month. At the mention of the jaundice and the back pain, Ethan's expression darkened so much that the Chamberlain fell silent. The picture was stubbornly taking shape into something he didn't want to think about. Jaundice, girdle pain, and exhaustion in a young woman. In his world, that combination often meant a tumor on the head of the pancreas, a death sentence even for the best clinics. He pushed the diagnosis aside and told himself that speculating without an examination was the last thing he should do. Lumendorf rose from behind the hills on the 5th day at sunset, a white city on 3 hills with a river flowing between granite banks. The palace stood on the highest hill, its golden roofs glowing in the sunset. But Ethan wasn't looking at the roofs. Near the city's southern gate, in the square, stood a structure made of fresh logs, a platform, a post, and neat bundles of brushwood. The Chamberlain followed his gaze and said in an even voice that this was by order of the supreme hierarch for the witch from the riverside quarters. The execution would take place in a week. Ethan asked what the witch had done. The Chamberlain replied that she had set bones and treated children for worms, and during interrogation she had confessed to everything she was supposed to confess to. They remained silent for the rest of the way. They were led into the palace through a small gate and guided down long corridors that smelled of wax and medicinal smoke. 6 light-bearers dressed in white and gold stood at the doors to the heiress's chambers. The eldest of them blocked their path. He was tall and noble-looking, with a face that was both weary and haughty. He introduced himself as Melchior, arch-light-bearer of the court, and said that the heiress's body had been entrusted to the order and that the village carver would only enter those doors over his dead body. The Chamberlain began to speak of the king's will. Melchior replied that above the king's will stood the will of the light. Ethan stood and peered through the door. The gaze of a 5th-level diagnostician could reach as far as 10 paces, and through the door he saw a faint silhouette on the bed. He saw an irregular heartbeat. He saw a shadow in the upper part of her abdomen. He lacked clarity, and every minute of the argument stole a piece of the picture from him. The dispute was cut short by a voice from deep within the chambers. A faint female voice said she wished to see the one everyone in the city was talking about. Melchior's face froze, and he stepped back. Ethan entered. The chambers were shrouded in twilight, and the scent of incense used to mask another odor, the smell of a long illness. On a wide bed, amid the pillows, lay a girl who would have been beautiful had more than half of her remained. Waxy, yellow skin, collarbones like a bird's, huge dark eyes on an emaciated face. Princess Ilaria looked at him without hope and without fear. She said he didn't look like a miracle worker. Ethan replied that the miracle workers hadn't helped her, which was why they'd sent for him. The corner of her mouth twitched. He asked permission to examine her with his hands and eyes, and warned that he would ask questions the doctors hadn't asked her. She agreed. He worked for an hour. The diagnostician's gaze moved layer by layer, and Ethan remained silent, his face calm, because 20 years at the operating table teach a face more than words ever could. The shadow in her abdomen took shape. The tumor was exactly where he'd feared it would be, in the head of the pancreas. It was compressing the bile duct, causing bile to enter the bloodstream, which explained the jaundice. But what came next was what had made the journey worthwhile. The tumor capsule was smooth. The major vessels behind it were clear. The liver was clear. The nearby lymph nodes were clear. He couldn't find a single metastasis. In his world, this was called an operable stage, and it meant one of the most difficult surgeries in the field. Here, it meant that death could be fought. Ilaria watched his face and asked quietly how much time she had left. All the doctors had lied to her, and she was tired of the lies. Ethan sat down on a stool by the bed and told her the truth. She had a tumor in her abdomen. The tumor was compressing the bile duct and killing her with jaundice and starvation. Light doesn't help her because light heals wounds, and a tumor isn't a wound. A tumor is a part of her own body that has gone haywire and is growing. It can only be removed with a scalpel. The incision would have to be deep and take a long time, and he wouldn't promise her life. He promises her 2 honest figures. Without a scalpel, she has less than 2 weeks left. With a scalpel, he estimates her chances at 3 out of 4. Ilaria was silent for a long time. Then she asked if it would hurt. Ethan replied that she would fall asleep before the first incision and wake up when it was all over. There would be no pain at all. She looked at him as if he were a talking beast. In her world, surgery didn't exist, but the absence of pain existed even less. Then she said she agreed, and that she wished to sign the consent form with her own hand in the presence of witnesses so that her death wouldn't be blamed on the doctor. For the first time in two worlds, Ethan had encountered a patient who had come up with the concept of informed consent on her own, and he bowed to her without any formalities. Next came the night with the king. Aldemar turned out to be a heavy-set old man with swollen legs and the eyes of a hunted beast. A casual glance revealed that he had a heart condition. The king asked only one thing: "Is there any hope?" Ethan repeated the numbers, 3 out of 4 with a knife and 0 without. Melchior, standing by the throne, said that cutting into the anointed one of the light was a defilement that dwarfed all else, and that the order would not allow it. And then the king rose from the throne and spoke so that the pendants on the fear. He said that for 30 years he had listened to the order, that the order had taken the tithe and the lands and the courts, and that when illness struck his only child, all the light of the order turned to smoke. He said that if tomorrow the order stood between the knife and his daughter, then the day after tomorrow he would settle the score with the order. Melchior bowed and left, and Ethan saw his shoulder blades moving beneath his white cassock. That very night, a messenger set out from the palace to the residence of the supreme hierarch, Severin. The operation was scheduled for the morning of the third day. For 2 days, Ethan prepared the princess. He gave her salted broth with honey to drink. He applied bile through a skin drainage tube beneath the gaze to reduce the jaundice. The system awarded a small reward for the drainage and raised painless sleep to level 2 with a reserve of 4 hours. Garvin boiled linens and prepared herbal decoctions. Ethan chose the operating room himself, a bright corner room with large windows. He ordered it to be scraped with lye 3 times. On the morning of the third day, the princess was carried to the operating table. She was wearing a simple white shirt and was calmer than anyone else in the palace. The king waited outside the doors. The baron's retainers and the royal guard stood mixed together at the doors. Ethan spread the pure field across the entire hall. He laid out the mirror-like steel. He looked at Garvin and at the 2 palace physicians whom he had trained over the course of 2 days to assist with the instruments. Then he placed his palm on Ilaria's forehead. She looked him in the eyes and said she trusted him. Painless sleep lulled her into a deep, steady slumber between 2 heartbeats. Ethan took the scalpel. Outside the windows, the sun was rising over Lumentor, and at that very hour, a long procession of white carriages was entering through the southern gates of the capital. Supreme Hierarch Severin had arrived in the city a week earlier than announced, and his first word on the steps of the cathedral was heresy. The tumor sat deep and clung to the princess's life like a tick. Ethan worked his way toward it layer by layer: skin, fat, muscle, peritoneum. The diagnostician's gaze guided his hands like a pilot steers a ship between shoals. He moved the stomach aside. He exposed the duodenum. He found the bile duct, swollen like a river reed. The head of the pancreas lay before him, and there it was, nestled inside, a dense bumpy mass the size of a plum. Ethan began the longest part of the procedure. In his former world, this operation was performed by a team of 6 and lasted up to 8 hours. He had 4 hours of painless sleep and 2 court physicians who couldn't tell a clamp from a pair of forceps. He simplified everything that could be simplified. The sight showed him every vessel before the scalpel reached it, saving him the time that would have eaten away at hours in his world. He didn't search. He saw. The thin thread knitted the stumps faster than Garvin could keep up. Ethan severed the gland's head along with the tumor and a horseshoe-shaped section of the intestine. He checked the edges with a sight. The edges were clean. Not a single infected focus remained. Next came the reassembly. He sewed the ducts and the intestine back together in a new configuration, his hands working from memory, having performed thousands of such procedures. As the third hour drew to a close, he placed the final stitch on the skin. The tumor lay in a porcelain bowl. Ilaria was breathing evenly, and her heart, as he could see with the gaze, was beating stronger than it had that morning. Ethan straightened up and heard the crunch of his own spine. Garvin sat on the floor against the wall because his legs could no longer support him. The palace physicians stared at the bowl containing the tumor, and one of them wept silently. Ethan walked out to the doors on his own. King Aldemar rose to meet him, and Ethan spoke 3 words. Everything had gone exactly as planned. The old king staggered, and the guards took him by the arms, but he brushed them aside and went to his daughter. He sat by her bedside until evening, holding her hand. That evening, Ilaria opened her. She looked at her father, then at Ethan, and asked when the operation would begin. Ethan replied that the operation had ended 5 hours ago. Hilaria didn't believe him. Then she tried to breathe deeply and cautiously, felt the stitches, and believed him. And then the heir to the throne of Solarian wept for the first time in 2 years of illness. The system expanded the window to full screen. The rescue of a royal from a fatal illness, highest difficulty category. The 4th level of all abilities has been unlocked. The Hand of Restoration ability has been unlocked. Ethan read the description and sat down right where he was standing. The Hand of Restoration accelerated tissue healing 3-fold and allowed him to fuse the edges of a wound by placing his palm on it. For the first time, the system had given him what the light bearers were capable of. Only his light came on top of knowledge rather than in place of it. For 3 days, Ethan didn't stray more than the adjacent room from the princess's side. The Hand of Restoration held the stitches in place. Garvin's potions kept her stomach settled. On the 3rd day, Hilaria sat up in bed and demanded real food. On the 5th, she walked across the room. The sallowness faded from her skin like ice melting from a river. And on that same 5th day, an embassy from the abode arrived at the palace. Supreme Hierarch Severin demanded an audience with the king. Ethan saw Severin through the gallery window. The hierarch was walking across the courtyard in a simple white cassock without any gold, and that was more terrifying than any gold. A gaunt, upright old man with a face of iconographic austerity. Behind him walked Melchior and Oswin, along with a dozen others in white. The diagnostician's gaze drifted toward the hierarch of its own accord, and Ethan noticed something strange. Severin was as healthy as an ox at 70, and only deep within his chest, near his heart, did the gaze catch a faint old shadow that was impossible to make out from such a distance. The reception was taking place before a full courtyard, and Ethan was placed at the throne to the king's right, and it was a display. Severin spoke quietly and politely, and every word landed like a stone against a wall. He congratulated the king on the heiress's recovery. He called it a mercy from the light that had descended in spite of the defilement of the knife, and not because of it. He said that the abode rejoiced along with the crown, and then he unfurled the scroll, and his voice did not waver in the slightest. The Council of Arch-Light-Bearers has examined the teachings of the carver Darren Holt. The doctrine of invisible rot denies the benevolent will of the light in sickness and death. The dissection of living flesh is declared an impurity of the first order. The doctrine is condemned as heresy. The bearer of the doctrine is ordered to recant and repent. In the event of refusal, the council imposes excommunication upon the heretic and an interdict upon any land that gives him shelter. The court fell silent. Ethan did not know that word, but from the expressions on the faces around him, he realized it was a terrible one. Later, the chamberlain explained it to him in a whisper. An interdict meant that the order would withdraw all light-bearers from the land under the ban. No one would tend to the wounds. No one would attend a complicated childbirth. No one would perform a funeral service for the deceased. For a kingdom where the order was the sole source of medical care, this meant taking the entire population hostage. Severin's blow was not aimed at the heretic. He had set his sights on the entire country and was offering the king a simple trade, one carver in exchange for all his subjects. King Aldemar was silent for a long time. Then he said that he had heard the council and would give his answer in 3 days. Severin bowed and left, and the white procession flowed out of the hall like milk from a jug. That evening, the king summoned Ethan to see him alone. The old man sat by the fireplace and looked 10 years older than he had that morning. He said he would not hand Ethan over and that the matter was settled, but he said something else as well. An interdict is not a bonfire for one person. It is a slow death for many. Women in labor, the wounded, children with fevers. The order will take the light from every village and attribute every death to a heretic. And in half a year, the people themselves will drag the surgeon to the stake and be justified in their own eyes. The king asked if the doctor had an answer to this. Not for the throne, for the villages. Ethan thought all night. He paced the quarters assigned to him and calculated. 1 surgeon is no substitute for 1,000 light-bearers. That wouldn't solve the problem. The problem could be solved in only one way, and that way had been before his eyes his whole life. A medical school, not a miracle worker, but a system. Ordinary people trained to wash their hands, to set bones, to stitch wounds, to deliver babies, to distinguish a hernia from a tumor, craftsmanship instead of mystery. In the morning, he placed a sheet of paper before the king. On the sheet was a plan for the world's first medical school, a shelter for it. 50 students in the first class, drawn from literate commoners and younger sons. Anatomy on carcasses from the slaughterhouse. A hospital attached to the school where students learn at the bedside, 3 years until the first class of paramedics graduates, and Ethan translated that word to the king as semi-doctor. The king read for a long time. Then he said that the order had been building its power for 300 years, yet the doctor was proposing to build a counterweight in 3 years. Ethan replied that he was proposing not a counterweight, but a water supply system. When there's water in the house, no one prays for rain. The king laughed for the first time in a week, and at that moment, Ilaria walked into the office without announcing herself. She was pale and upright, holding onto the doorframe, but standing on her own 2 feet on the 8th day after undergoing a full abdominal incision. She said she had been eavesdropping and wasn't ashamed of it. She said that the school needed a home, a patron, and money, and that she had all of these things. She owned her grandmother's widow's castle on the outskirts of the capital and possessed the personal treasury of an heiress. She said she had been condemned and then rescued, and that now this was her war too. The king looked at his daughter, and something in his face began to unravel, knot by knot. He said that the response to the council was ready. 3 days later, King Aldemar granted Severin an audience, and his reply, "The crown will not hand over Dr. Holt." The crown announces the establishment of a royal medical school under the patronage of the heir to the throne. The crown offered the order peace and a division of labor. The clergy would heal physical wounds, and the school would heal what lay beyond the clergy's power. If, however, the order imposed an interdict, the crown would respond by auditing the order's tithes across all lands for the past 30 years. It was a knife to the throat in return. The order's treasury would not have withstood an honest audit, and everyone in the hall knew it. Severin listened with the expression of an icon. Then he said quietly that he had heard the crown's proposal, that the council would now withdraw for prayer, and that the light itself would render its judgment. He blessed the hall with a general gesture and left. A week later, when the court had nearly breathed its last in the capital, the first news arrived of what the light's judgment was like. In the riverside quarters of Lumentor, a midwife had burned to death that night along with her house, the very same woman to whom Ethan had already sent an invitation for the school's first enrollment. The found traces of oil in the ashes. The monastery's inquiry announced that very same day that the woman had dropped a lamp and that it was all the will of the light. Ethan stood among the ashes and said nothing. Ilaria, who arrived shortly afterward, said with pale lips that the war had already begun, it just hadn't been declared yet. Ethan replied that in that case, the school needed to open in a month, not in half a year. Because in war, the one who establishes order faster wins. The widow's castle stood on the western edge of the capital, beyond the old park. For half a century, only the caretaker and the pigeons had lived there. Ethan entered it with a convoy of craftsmen, and an hour later he realized that a month was far too short. The roof was leaking, the floors were rotting, the well stank, but the castle's structure was sound. Thick walls, large windows on the top floor, a huge refectory that could serve as an anatomy theater, a separate wing for a hospital. Ilaria took charge of what Ethan was completely incapable of handling: money, contracts, and people. She ran things from her armchair because she still couldn't stand for long, and contractors would leave her office drenched in sweat. The capital quickly realized that the heiress counted every krona and remembered every promise. Tolman Bray sent 3 wagon loads of lumber and glass from Windhall, along with a letter stating that he had invested in the surest venture of his life. Baron Redgar sent 10 guards for protection, and Corvus from the Harbor District arrived in person with a crew of loaders, declaring that the district owed the woodcarver a debt and that the port paid its debts with labor. Ethan personally oversaw the recruitment of apprentices. He had town criers post announcements throughout all the districts. Literacy was required. Age 14 to 30, any social class, gender was irrelevant. Those last 2 words caused a greater scandal in the capital than all heresies combined. 400 people came to the castle gates. Ethan weeded them out for 3 days. He did not look for knowledge because no one had any. He looked at their hands, at their contempt, and at how a person behaves in the presence of another suffering. He made them hold a slippery pig intestine and sew it with a needle. He led them to the hospital wing, where the sick from all over the capital were already being brought, and watched to see who turned away and who drew closer. By the end of the third day, he had selected 52 people, the sons of artisans, 2 orphans from the monastery with impeccable handwriting, a former regimental bone setter, Martha, the butcher's daughter, who sewed pig intestines better than half the interns from Ethan's past life, the Count's youngest son, who had run away from home, and Ion's brother. Ion had arrived from Windhall with a single bag. He said that the monastery had stripped him of his priesthood for aiding heresy, and that in 40 years of his life he had never once understood what he was doing, but in a single week by the canal he had figured it out. He asked to become an apprentice to a man half his age. Ethan enrolled him as the top student and appointed him head of the class. Their studies began amid the construction site, anatomy in the mornings. Ethan taught it using pig carcasses from the slaughterhouse and his own drawings, which Martha traced neatly onto large sheets of paper. In the afternoons, the students worked in the hospital wing. They washed, they fed patients, they changed bandages, they learned to observe. In the evenings, they studied literacy, arithmetic, and Latin, which Ethan introduced as the secret language of the craft because local words for half of the things simply didn't exist. After 2 weeks, he let them cut for the first time, not on people. On pumpkins with a pig intestine sewn inside. The capital watched the castle as if it were on fire. Terrifying stories were spread about the school. They said that the dead were boiled there and that the heiress had been swapped out. But every day, those who had been carried in on stretchers walked out of the infirmary wing on their own 2 feet, and each such person spoke louder than 10 sermons. The line at the gates grew longer, the monastery remained silent, and that silence weighed heavier than any threats. Ashvin stayed in the capital. His white cloak was seen sometimes at the castle gates, sometimes in the neighborhoods from which the students came. He did nothing. He simply talked to people, politely and at length. And after his conversations, the parents of 3 students demanded their children be returned home, and the lie supplier suddenly broke off the contract. A silent war was raging, and Ethan responded with the same weapon: work. Toward the end of the first month, something happened that turned the silent war into a loud one. A woman in labor from the riverside neighborhoods was brought to the school. Her name was Nisa, and she had been in labor for 3 days. The neighborhood midwife had died in a fire a month earlier, and there was no one to replace her. The neighborhood lightbringer relieved the woman's pain twice a day, and on the 3rd day, he told her husband that everything was in the hands of the light. Her husband was a boatman. He placed his wife in a boat and rowed her halfway across the city. The diagnostician's examination revealed a transverse fetal position and the onset of a fever. In the old world, this was called an advanced case and could be resolved in only one way. Ethan announced to his students that they were about to witness a cesarean section. He performed the surgery in the anatomical theater with the full first-year class present. Painless sleep. Clearfield. Incision. 4 minutes after the first stroke of the scalpel, a baby cried out in the theater. A boy, alive. Another half-hour later, Ethan closed the uterus and the abdomen, and the hand of restoration rested on the suture. Nisa awoke, and her son was placed on her chest. 52 students stood and watched, and that evening, the school ceased to be a place of learning for them and became a faith. The boatman stood at the castle gates and shouted to the whole street that his wife and son had been slaughtered and resurrected, and that he allowed anyone to examine him. By morning, all of Lumentor was talking about it. By noon, 2 more women in labor were brought to the school, and by evening, the abode broke its silence. The cathedral heralds proclaimed the hierarch's words in the town squares: impurity is multiplying in the city. The light mourns and withdraws from the defiled places. From now on, the light bearers will not enter the house from which they were sent to the carvers, nor will they lay their hands on those who accepted their help. It was an interdict of little blood, not against the kingdom, against each individual person. The choice between light and the knife was placed on every threshold. The calculation was cold and precise. Light was as familiar as bread, while the knife was terrifying and new. In the first few days, Severin's plan worked. The line at the school gates thinned by 2/3. People were afraid of being left without any light at all. Rumors spread through the neighborhoods that children who accepted the knife were born marked. 3 women in labor fled the hospital wing at night. Ethan gathered his students and told them there was only one way they would answer to the abode. to work so that the choice between light and the knife would cease to be a choice between the familiar and the terrifying, and instead become a choice between death and life. He divided the senior students into pairs and assigned them to see patients. Simple cases: boils, splinters, fractures, and diarrhea in children. He took on the difficult cases himself. Martha and Iona assisted with surgeries without needing any prompts. Meanwhile, the system kept tally. It counted those saved by the student's hands as half a credit for the bearer, and Ethan quickly realized that, to the system, the school was a multiplier. By the end of the second month, the counter had surpassed 400, unlocking the 5th level of the gaze, with the ability to see the subtlest currents and the 6th hour of painless sleep. And then, the abode made a mistake. In the leather workers' quarter, the son of the quarter's foreman fell ill with a fever and abdominal pain. The boy was 10. The foreman was a man of the abode to the very core, and made an offering to the cathedral every year. He summoned the light bearers. For 2 days, the 3 of them infused the boy with light. Any student at the school would have recognized a ruptured appendix. The light relieved the pain, and the boy quietly slipped away without a cry. On the 3rd night, his father could bear it no longer and carried his son to the castle himself, across the entire city in his arms. Ethan operated on the boy's purulent peritonitis for 6 hours. He flushed the area. He inserted drains, the hand of restoration, herbal concoctions, and 3 days without sleep at the bedside. The boy survived. And the foreman of the tanners returned to the cathedral and, in full view of the congregation, removed the sun symbol from his neck and placed it on the steps. And he said that the light had held his son by the hand while he was dying, but the knife had brought him back, and that he was the foreman of the tanners guild, and his word was law in the quarter. The capital's quarters began to turn, slowly and with a creak, like a heavily laden barge turning. Osmond disappeared from the city that same week. And 10 days later, a messenger from Baron Redgar, riding 2 horses to exhaustion, galloped up to the school. The Baron's message was brief. Ethan got ready in 2 hours. He took with him Iona Martha and 8 senior students, those who had survived the port ordeal or hadn't flinched at the filth. Ilaria wrested a travel permit from her father, granting her the right to requisition supplies and 30 guards. She wanted to go herself, and for the first time, Ethan raised his voice at her. He said that her womb had been cut open 2 months earlier, and that an heiress in a plague-stricken city was a gift to Severin. Ilaria said she would remember that tone. And she stayed behind to run the school and guard the capital. They covered the journey in 4 days. At the last station before Windhall, they were met by the Baron's guard wearing a mask made of a rag soaked in vinegar. He said that more than 200 people had already died in the city and that the Baron was alive and maintaining order with an iron fist. Ethan put boiled linen masks on everyone and ordered no one to take them off, on pain of being sent home. Windhall greeted them with the smoke of bonfires and empty streets. The gates were opened, but remained chained shut. Baron Redgar looked 10 years older. He said he had sealed off the city on the 3rd day, and that the townspeople were obeying for now because they remembered the port plague and the cauldrons. But fear in the city was rising like water and would soon sweep through the gates. Ethan went to examine the sick. The diagnostician's gaze gave him a complete picture within an hour of his rounds through the plague barracks. Fever, black bruises across the skin, swollen lymph nodes in the groins and armpits of half the patients. Blood was disintegrating and clotting in the vessels all at once. It was her. The very same death that had decimated the cities of his world in the Dark Ages. The plague. But the 7th level gaze saw the rot itself. Tiny rods swarmed in the blood and in the lymph nodes, and for the first time in this world, Ethan saw the pathogen directly inside a patient's body. The system remained silent throughout the entire rounds, then opened a window he had never seen before. A threat of mass extinction has been detected. The Moore Protocol has been activated. The bearer has been granted access to a special branch of rewards. The first reward under the protocol is issued in advance, the Elixir of the Bitter Root. 30 doses, suppresses decay in the blood, doses replenished based on the number of lives saved. A box of dark glass vials materialized in Ethan's hands. He opened one, sniffed it, and almost laughed. The smell was familiar to any doctor in his world. It was an antibiotic, harsh and bitter, but genuine. 30 doses for a city where hundreds were sick. It was as if the system had heard him and added a line. For every 10 people saved, 10 doses are replenished. The speed of rescue determines the speed of replenishment. Ethan understood the rules. The system provided not a warehouse, but a pump. You pump out life and receive the means to keep pumping. In Windhall, he put into practice what he remembered from his epidemiology textbooks and from the Port District. The city was divided into 4 sections, and movement between them was prohibited. The sick were taken to a plague barracks by the wall, the dead were cremated outside the wall with lime, and Ethan had to endure the most difficult conversation with the city's priest of the dead because of this. The homes of the sick were fumigated with sulfur and washed with lye. All the city's children were paid a dime each to kill rats, because the gays had shown Ethan the same rot in the rats' blood and in the fleas, and the chain of infection fell into place. He distributed the first 30 doses himself. Using the gays, he selected those who were on the brink, but had not yet the brink. The elixir broke the disease within a day. People who had already been given their last rites got up and asked for food. Word of a miracle spread throughout the city, and Ethan didn't argue. The miracle fostered discipline better than any orders. The students took turns manning the barracks. Martha cut open the matured abscesses and cleaned them so thoroughly that Ethan held up her work as an example. Iona went where it was most terrifying, and his light gift returned to him of its own accord. Without any ordination, the light sustained the hearts of the gravely ill, while the elixir broke down the decay. The cycle began. 10 saved, T20, 50. The doses were replenished, and Ethan sped up the cycle. By the second week, the death curve had turned and began to decline, and by the third week, Ethan finally had time to ask the question that had been burning in his mind since day one. Where did it come from? The plague doesn't fall from the sky. The evidence pointed to the rot in the rats. But rats had always lived in Windhall, and the plague had just arrived. He started with the basics. He questioned the neighborhood leaders to find out where the first cases had occurred. All the initial cases were concentrated in a single area near the northern market, the market stalls by the warehouses. Ethan pulled up the weighmaster's records from the week before the plague. Many caravans entered the city, but one was strange. A grain caravan that had come from the north without a trade seal and had stopped near the warehouses for 2 days. It didn't sell the grain. It left on the 3rd day. The storekeeper recalled that the sacks smelled of carrion and that the wagon drivers hadn't taken off their gloves even in the heat. The storekeeper also remembered that the day before the wagon arrived, all the light bearers of the monastery had suddenly left the city. Their leader had announced that the brothers were being recalled to the cathedral. Ethan put 2 and 2 together. The caravan had stopped at the warehouses a day after the light bearers left. The first people fell ill 3 days after the caravan's arrival. All of the first households either bought grain or worked at the warehouses. It wasn't grain that arrived in the sacks. What arrived in the sacks were dead rats and their fleas. This wasn't a plague. It was a weapon. He reported this to the Baron that evening, face to face. The Baron listened, and his face flushed with dark blood. He said he understood everything except one thing. Why? Ethan replied that the answer lay in who the plague was meant to kill. Windhall is the carver's city. Here lie his first survivors and his fame. If the carver's city were to die out from the plague while the carver was still alive, a single word would spread throughout all the lands. The light had departed and corruption had brought death, a sermon written in corpses. The Baron was silent for a long time. Then he said that he had a man in the borderlands who, for a price, could track any wagon train, and that if the trail led where they both suspected, then he, Baron Redgar, sworn to the crown and the light, would follow that trail to the very end. The search took 10 days. The Baron's man returned with testimony from innkeepers and toll collectors. The grain wagon had come from the north over the pass. There, on a rocky plateau, stood an old monastery of the order called the Monastery of Vigil. It was closed. Outsiders had not been allowed in for half a century. The wagon drivers had spent the night there twice, and the bridge toll collector recognized a white cassock under one of their cloaks. The Baron's man added another piece of testimony to these accounts. A month before the Windhall plague, a similar unmarked wagon train had traveled along the southern route toward the capital. Ethan felt the ground give way beneath his feet. The capital, the school, Alaria. He roused the students that very night. The plague in Windhall was dying down, and the Baron and trained senior officers could handle the patrol duties. He left Ion in charge with half a vial of the elixir and the complete protocol records. He himself set out at dawn with Martha and the students. Before they left, the system beeped quietly and briefly. More protocol.
411 saved. The Eye of Rot ability unlocked.
From now on, the bearer can see pockets of rot in water, food, and air within sight without touching them. Ethan looked at the city well and saw it as clear and green. He looked at the plague barracks and saw a pale, fading glow in the corners. Now he could search for the plague just as one searches for fire in the night. They drove their horses south, and on the third day, refugees began to appear along the way. First, lone travelers, then families with wagons. People said different things, yet all the same. The capital is in turmoil. Apparently, a disease had broken out in the riverside districts, and white carriages were converging on the capital from all the lands because Hierarch Severin had announced in the main square a great prayer service to purify the capital of defilement. The prayer service is scheduled for 6 days from now. Ethan listened and took it all in at once. The plague has already been sown in the riverside districts, among the water and the rats. They let it flare up just in time for the prayer service. At the prayer service, Severin will declare the plague a punishment for the school, for the knife, and for the crown that sheltered the heretic. The crowd, driven mad by fear, will burn down the school itself and tear the carvers to pieces, and no guard will be able to hold them back. And then the abode will show mercy, and the plague will miraculously subside, because the one who sows also knows when to reap. Everything had been calculated by the man who had ruled the faith for 300 years. Ethan had 6 days, 1 school, and the eye of rot. And for the first time since the transfer, he caught himself realizing that he wasn't going to save a patient. He was going to war against a colleague, against the only person in this world who had also understood that the disease was a tool. Only Severin had turned that tool's blade against the people. They rode into the capital at the end of the second day, driving 4 horses. The city was still going about its usual business, but Ethan could already see what no one else could. The eye of rot was burning. Over the riverside neighborhoods near the southern bend, a murky glow hung like a mirage over a garbage dump in the heat. The outbreak had taken root exactly where he'd suspected, by the water near the warehouses, along the rat trails. The school welcomed him with everyone present. Ilaria listened to the report in silence, her fingers turning white as they gripped the armrests. Then she said that her father had taken to his bed 3 days ago. His heart. The palace light-bearers were easing his attacks, but the king could barely get out of bed. The administration had gathered for a council where half the attendees were from the abode, and in this situation they had 4 days until the prayer. Ethan laid out the plan on the table just as he would lay out his tools. First, find and eradicate the hotspots before the plague causes an outbreak. Second, gather evidence that the plague has been sown, because without evidence, any fight against the plague will be declared a cover-up. Third, to survive the prayer ritual. That night, he walked through the riverside neighborhoods with the eye. The glow guided him like a dog on a trail. He found 4 locations: an abandoned warehouse filled with sacks of that very grain, teeming with dead rats, 2 cesspools where carrion had been dumped, and an old water intake that supplied 3 streets. A glance revealed the familiar sticks in the sacks, the same ones as in Windhall. He didn't touch anything. He brought the heiress's guards, the city judge, and 2 district elders to the warehouse and made everyone watch and take notes in the presence of witnesses. The judge was a reserved and cautious man. He wrote everything down and said that what was recorded constituted an attempt to poison the capital, and that such a crime was punishable by quartering. But he said something else as well. The paperwork would link the wagon train to the warehouse, and the warehouse to the plague. The paperwork would not link the wagon train to the house of vigil without a living person to say so aloud before the court. The wagon drivers had vanished. An insider witness was needed. The hotbeds were cleared out in 2 days. The sacks and carry-on were burned with lime right on the spot. The pits were filled with slaked lime. The water intake was sealed off, and within a day, Corvus and his crew set up barrels of boiled water on 3 streets, following the Port District's protocol. A war on rats was declared throughout the southern part of the city. The school switched to martial law. The hospital wing was preparing a plague barracks with a capacity of 100 beds. Marta was boiling lye in cauldrons. There were 60 doses of Gorky Corn's elixir left, and Ethan prayed to all the gods of both worlds that the pump would have time to get up to speed if the plague broke out. The eye of rot gave him something no epidemiologist in his world possessed. He could see the infected before symptoms appeared. In the evenings, he walked through the markets and streets of the South, watching the people. Here and there in the crowd, his eyes would catch the dim sparks within their bodies. He ordered such people to be gently taken by the arm and led to the barracks for lodging and food. The people resisted. Rumors spread that the carvers were snatching up healthy people. Osvin, having returned to the city, fanned these rumors through his discreet informants. Everything hung by a thread, and that thread was held only by the count of those saved, which was already rising. The pre-flare elixir wiped out the infected with a single dose, and the pump refilled the vials. 2 days before the prayer service, there was a knock at the school gates in the middle of the night. Ethan opened the gate himself. Standing outside the gate was a man in a traveling cloak with his hood pulled down, and hiding behind him was a second man, shorter in stature. The man removed his hood, and Ethan recognized his brother, Kylam, the very same light-bringer from Windhall Square who had once declared a dying cart driver to be healed. Kylam looked haggard and aged. He said that after that incident in the square, he could no longer live as he had before, so he requested a transfer and was sent north to the abode of vigil. He thought he was going there to pray away his doubts, but he had arrived at a workshop of death. He had seen the basements filled with cages of rats. He saw brothers in waxed robes and glass masks. He saw them loading sacks. He brought along the novice Tobin, who walked among the sacks, and whose hands Ethan examined first. On Tobin's wrist was a healing mark from flea bites, and in the blood, Ethan's gaze found a faint trace of past rot. The boy had suffered through a mild form of the illness and survived, without even understanding what had made him sick. Kylam said he would speak before any court. He said that the light in which he believed did not sow death in the grain, and whoever sows it is no longer his brother. Ethan listened and understood that he held the key to the entire case in his hands, and that the abode would do everything in its power to destroy that key. Kylam and Tobin were hidden in the heiress's castle under the protection of the Baron's guards. The judge took sworn testimony from both of them in triplicate. One copy went to Tolman Bray's hiding place, the second went to the Baron, the third remained with Ilaria. In the morning, one day before the prayer service, Ilaria made a move that Aitan had not agreed to. She wrote to her father and secured a convening of the royal council, and at the council, in the presence of the order's representatives, she announced that the crown had become aware of the circumstances surrounding the Windhall plague, and that after the prayer service, the crown would make them public. She had deliberately burned her bridges. Now Severine had no time left for quiet assassinations. He had no choice but to either retreat or strike with everything he had tomorrow in the square. Hilaria returned to the school and told Ethan that she had drawn the bowstring tight and that it would be up to him to take the shot. That evening, everyone who owed them a debt flocked to the school. Corvus brought 300 porters from all over the harbor. The foreman of the tanners brought his workshop. Nisa the boatwoman stood at the gate with her son in her arms, and the river districts stood with her. The Baron sent word that Windhall's retinue had entered the capital under the guise of a merchant escort. Tolman Bray had bought up all the seats on the balconies surrounding the main square for his loyal followers. The city was splitting right before their eyes, and along this fault line, either a crack or an abyss was bound to open tomorrow. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. He sat alone in the anatomy theater, and the system suddenly opened a window without any saved data. The lines were different than usual. The system reported that it was recording an unprecedented event. The carrier is changing not the outcomes of diseases, but the fate of the world. A hidden branch of rewards has been unlocked. The first reward of the branch is being awarded early. The doctor's word. The description was brief. Once a day, the carrier's voice is heard clearly by everyone within sight without the need to shout. Ethan reread it 3 times and smiled wearily. The system handed him a microphone. Tomorrow, in the square, facing the man who had held every academic chair in the country for 300 years. This was exactly what he needed. The morning of the prayer service dawned clear and windless. Lumendor's main square held 40,000 people, and still couldn't accommodate everyone. The white rows of the monastery stretched from the cathedral to the fountain. Severin climbed onto the cathedral porch in a simple cassock, and the square fell so silent that the cooing of pigeons could be heard. He spoke for an hour. He spoke of the corruption that had entered the capital, of the knife that cuts the image of God, of the plague already smoldering in the riverside districts, and he named the districts precisely, and the first groan of horror rippled through the crowd. He delivered his sermon as a surgeon makes an incision. By the end of the hour, 40,000 people were on the verge of howling. And when Severin raised his hand toward the west, toward the school, and declared that the source of the corruption was known to all, the crowd swayed toward it with their whole bodies. And then Ethan stepped out of the ranks into the open space between the crowd and the cathedral, alone, in a white doctor's coat, and he spoke in a normal voice that everyone in the square could hear all the way to the back row. He said that the hierarch was right. A plague was indeed smoldering in the riverside districts. He said he knew this better than anyone because he had spent 3 days burning out its hotbeds, and he would show those hotbeds to anyone who went to look. And then he asked the crowd one thing: how does His Holiness the Hierarch know about the plague in the riverside districts if, according to the monastery itself, not a single light bearer has set foot in those districts for a month? The square fell silent. 40,000 heads turned toward the cathedral. Severin stood motionless, and Ethan, across the entire square, could see with his gaze how the old man's heart was pounding next to that old shadow in his chest. The silence lasted 3 beats of that heart, and then a high, cracked voice rang out from the direction of the cathedral. It was Oswin shouting.
He shouted that the heretic was lying and that the light knew everything, and that shout was a mistake because the crowd heard not faith, but fear in it. And into that crack, Ethan drove the wedge he had prepared. He said he wasn't asking them to take his word for it.
He was asking for a trial, an open royal trial where, under oath, he would reveal where the plague in Winhall had come from and who had brought the infected grain to the capital, and where a brother from the monastery who had witnessed with his own eyes how death was being prepared would give his testimony. A silence hung over the square, in which the fate of the kingdom was being decided. And it was neither Ethan nor Severin who broke that silence first. From the balcony overlooking the square, Ilaria, the heir to the throne, stepped forward, wearing a dress that left her exposed to everyone's gaze and without any guards, and her voice ringing with fury announced that the crown had ordered such a trial to be held in 3 days, and that until the trial, anyone who raised a hand against the school or the abbey would answer to her personally. The crowd exhaled in unison, as if it were a single person. The tension drained from it like pus from a lanced boil. Severin turned and walked into the cathedral without saying a word, and the white-robed ranks streamed after him. The prayer ended not in a massacre, but in a summons to court. That evening, Ethan was exhausted, but the system wouldn't let him sleep. It opened a window marked "More Protocol." The lines were alarming. The Eye of Rot has detected a new outbreak. Direction: the palace. Ethan sprang to the window and looked across the city toward the palace hill. Above the golden roofs, in the light of the setting sun, hung a barely perceptible, murky haze. Whoever had sown death in the king's house? 3 days before the trial, Ethan entered the palace an hour after sunset with Martha, 2 apprentices, and a chest of elixir. The heiress's pass opened the doors, but Melchior's palace light-bearers stood guard at the king's chambers, and Melchior himself stood among them. Ethan had expected a fight, but he got something else. The arch-light-bearer looked haggard. He led Ethan into an alcove and spoke quickly and quietly. He said he had served the crown for 30 years and had not believed in the plague of the cities until yesterday. Yesterday, Severin's message had been relayed to him. The message was this: if the trial takes place, Melchior must remember that the king's health is in the hands of the light, and that the light can grow weary. Melchior said that he was ambitious and a schemer, and many other things besides, but he was no king's poisoner, and so he would now step away from those doors with his men, and let the carver decide for himself what he would see inside. Ethan entered the king's chamber. Aldemar lay there, pale and swollen, and at a glance, 2 ailments were immediately apparent. The first was an old one. His worn-out heart barely pumped blood, and his lungs were filled with fluid. The second affliction was new, and it glowed with the eye. In the king's left shoulder, around a fresh mark left by the healing laying on of hands, a focus of rot smoldered. Not the plague. Something else. His gaze found a creeping infection in the blood that poisoned it slowly and surely, mimicking the symptoms of wasting away from old age. One of those who had poured light into him carried death in the palms of his hands. Ethan did not bother to find out who. There was no time for that. He gave the king the elixir, applied a drain to the source of the infection, and the hand of restoration rested on his shoulder. By midnight, the fever had begun to subside. By morning, the king was breathing without wheezing for the first time in a week. Ethan left Martha and her students with the king around the clock, ordering them not to let any hands other than their own near the king's body, and to record everyone who entered. He personally inspected the palace kitchen and water supply with the eye and forced them to switch to the school's protocol. He took from the chamberlain a list of everyone who had laid hands on the king over the past month. There were 9 names on the list, and all 9 were brothers sent by the cathedral itself. The trail led to the same place as everything else. For 3 days leading up to the trial, the city lived as if on a powder keg. The monastery did not remain silent. Rumors spread through the neighborhoods that a heretic would cast a spell on the judges during the trial. 2 senior jurors refused to participate, citing illness, but Ethan's gaze found both men to be in good health, though their hands were trembling. That night, unknown assailants set fire to the hayloft near the heiress's castle. But the blaze was put out. Witnesses were guarded in shifts by the Baron's guards and Corvus's porters, and Kale wrote for all 3 days. He drew a map from a memory of the monastery of Vigil, including its cellars and attics, along with a list of the brothers he had seen in their waxed robes. The trial opened in the throne room with the throne empty because the king had not yet risen, and Ilaria sat in the heiress's chair at the foot of the throne. There were 7 judges, the city judge, 2 guild elders, 2 counts, the crown treasurer, and at the insistence of the abode, the archlight-bearer Melchior. Severin arrived on his own and sat in the front row as a mere spectator, and that was a strategic move. It showed that he was not the one on trial. The city judge presented the case for the prosecution, and he built it up like a stonemason. The records of the Windhall Way masters, the storekeeper's testimony regarding the smell of rot and the gloves, documents regarding the lightbearer's departure from the city the day before the convoy. The inspection report of the capital's warehouse containing contaminated grain conducted in the presence of witnesses. Ethan's conclusion regarding the uniform rot in Winhall and in the sacks. The judge forced Ethan to explain this invisible rot to the court for an hour, and Ethan explained it as simply as he would to children, that the rot is alive and as fine as dust, that it lives in rats and fleas and spreads to humans. About boiled water and the port district that survived, and about Windhall, where the death curve was reversed in 2 weeks by the very same hands that now stand before the court. The courtroom listened so intently that the scribes' quills could be heard scratching. Then the Abbey's defense attorney rose, a scholar brother, with a voice as velvety as his cassock. He did not dispute the facts. He disputed their connection. There was a caravan, but whose it was is unknown. The grain was rotten, but rotten grain is not uncommon. The brothers had left Windhall for the cathedral, and here is an excerpt regarding the cathedral. And the doctrine of rot is heresy. Therefore, all the heretics' conclusions are merely the opinion of a condemned doctrine. He spoke for 2 hours, and Ethan could see the scales tipping in the judges' minds, word against word, paper against paper. And then the court called for Calum. Calum entered the hall in layman's clothing, standing with his back straight. He gave his name, the office from which he had been stripped, and the place of his last ministry, the monastery of Vigil. A murmur rippled through the hall. Calum spoke for 3 hours, about the cellars, about the 3-tiered granaries infested with rats, about the brothers in waxed robes and glass masks who entered through double doors coated with lime, about the sacks of grain into which they stuffed one dead rat after another, about how he asked the eldest brother why they did this, and the eldest brother replied that the light purifies the field before sowing, about the unmarked convoys heading south and west. He spoke calmly and menacingly, and when the monastery's defender tried to ask whether the defrocked priest had lost his mind, the courtroom grew so noisy that the judge had to bang his gavel. Then they brought out Tobin, and the boy showed his wrists with bite marks, and Ethan, during the trial, conveyed with a glance and explained in words the shadow of the rot he had endured in his blood, and 3 doctors from the school confirmed under oath that they saw the same thing with their trained eyes. It was a blow that the velvet-clad brother could not parry. A single witness may lie. Blood does not lie. By evening of the 2nd day, the court retired to deliberate. The city stood in the squares and waited. Ethan sat in the reception hall, his hands numb with exhaustion. Ilaria sat beside him, silent. Behind the wall, the capital breathed with 40,000 lungs. The judges emerged with their verdict at midnight. The city judge read it out in a dry tone. The court finds it proven that the plague in Wendell and the outbreaks in the capital resulted from the deliberate poisoning of grain with infected seeds. The court finds the involvement of the monastery of Vigil proven. The court orders that the royal authority seize the monastery of Vigil, conduct a search, and execute the guilty parties in accordance with the law on grain poisoning. Regarding the charges against the supreme hierarch Severin, the court declares that no direct evidence of his intent has been presented and leaves the matter to the council and the crown. Melchior signed the verdict along with everyone else, and Ethan understood that this was the signature of a man who had jumped from a sinking ship. The hall erupted, half roared with triumph, half fell deathly silent. Severin rose from his seat in the front row. He He stood straight and pale, waiting for silence, and silence came to him, as was the hall's old custom. He said quietly that he accepted the decision of the earthly court, that those guilty in the abode of vigilance, if there were any, would be handed over to the judgment of the light itself, and that he was old and could see beyond this very night. He looked across the hall directly at Ethan and spoke words that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He said that the carver had won the argument about grain, but would lose the argument about man, because the carver brings people the truth that they are nothing more than mechanisms, and he, Severin, brings them the lie that they are children of the light. And when people become truly afraid, they will not run to the mechanic, they will run to the Father. With that, he left, his white retinue following him. That night, the abode of vigilation went up in flames. Messengers brought the news 2 days later. The royal detachment, which had set out to capture the abode, found nothing but a burnt-out ruin on the plateau. The fire had started from within. In all the wings at once, the brothers in their waxed robes perished in the flames along with the cellars, basements, and all the answers. Severin literally handed the guilty over to the judgment of the light. The ends were burned away, and a day later, Martha fell ill. She returned from her morning rounds at the plague barracks, sat down pale-faced on a bench in the anatomy theater, and said she thought she had a fever. Ethan turned around, and the gaze with the eye gave him a vision that made everything inside him stop. Marta's blood was teeming with decay, but not the kind found in Windhall, nor the kind found in the river districts. This was unfamiliar. The rods were longer, and the eye glowed around her, not a dirty yellow but lilac, a color Ethan had never seen before. The system activated on its own, without a prompt. More protocol. Mutated strain detected. No matches found in the carrier registry. The bitterroot elixir is conditionally effective. Adaptation required. The alchemy of blood reward chain has been unlocked. The first adaptation task is to isolate a pure strain focus. Ethan read the lines and looked at Martha. The school's top student sat before him with a disease that hadn't existed in the world just a day ago. Not all of the abode of vigilance had burned down. Her work lived on, and the first blow of this altered death did not strike the city or the king. It struck the school right at its heart, the very heart of what Ethan had been building. Martha looked at his face and understood everything from his expression, just as surgical students understand their mentors. She asked in an even voice how much time she had left and what she should write down while she was still lucid. Ethan took her hand and said that he would be the one to write it down, and she would live, because he had never lost anyone at the operating table, and because now this was no longer a dispute over grain. Now it was a battle for a human life, the very one Severin had promised him he would lose. Ethan put the school on high alert within an hour. Martha was placed in a separate room in the hospital wing with double doors and lime on the threshold. He personally scanned everyone who had come into contact with her over the past day with the eye. Everyone was clean except for one younger student who had carried the morning buckets with Martha. The first spark of purple rot smoldered in the boy's blood. He was placed next to her behind the wall. 2 cases. Ethan prayed to both worlds that they would remain just the 2. He began the war against the strain, just as he began any operation, with reconnaissance. His 7th level vision allowed him to peer into Martha's blood for hours, and he did just that. The purple rot was faster than the old strain. It hid inside the blood cells, like a thief in a stranger's house, which is why the elixir had trouble reaching it. Bitterroot knocked out the part that floated freely, while the hidden part bided its time and emerged again. The disease came in waves. The fever rose and fell, and each wave left Martha weaker. The system guided him through the blood alchemy chain, step by step. The first task required a pure strain sample, and Ethan extracted it from the matured lump under Martha's armpit using a thin, hollow needle from the steel set. The system accepted the sample directly through the instrument and issued the second task. A survivor was needed, the blood of a person who had recovered and was back on their feet. The logic was painfully familiar to Ethan. Serum, antibodies. His world had traveled this path over the centuries, and the system was proposing to cover it in a matter of days if the resources were available, but there was no survivor. The strain had emerged a week ago in the burned-down monastery, and everyone who could have recovered from it had perished in the fire along with it. Ethan had been poring over the records all night, and at dawn, Calum called for him. The former Lightbringer had been living at the school all these days and working in the barracks alongside the students. He listened to the story about the survivor's blood and suddenly froze. Then he said slowly that there might indeed be a survivor. In the monastery of Vigil, there was a remote cell where Brother Anselm lived. an old man whom the brothers called the Marked One. 20 years ago, he had been the first to work in the cellars. He had contracted every possible disease and survived, and since then, no infection had taken hold of him. They kept him at the monastery as a relic and as a safeguard. Anselm's blood was used to test new strains of the rot on him. If the old man was alive, his blood was a library of all the monastery's strains over the past 20 years. Kalaim said something else as well. When the monastery burned, Anselm might not have been there. Every fall, the old man was taken to the hot springs in the mountain village of Kragenvel, a 3-day journey from the plateau. It was fall now. Ethan got ready in an hour. He couldn't leave Martha, and he couldn't not go, so Martha decided for him. She said she'd keep the records herself for now from memory, and that if he brought back the blood, he'd make it in time. But if he stayed by her bedside, he wouldn't. Ethan left the care protocol with the senior students. Elixir via heat waves, hydration, examinations twice a day, carried out by 3 of the school's doctors whom he'd managed to train in the basics of blood reading. He took Calum with him, who knew Anselm by sight, and 4 of the Baron's retainers. Ilaria gave him a travel permit and said one word: hurry! They raced north for 3 days with almost no sleep. Kragenvel lay in a mountain fold near the hot springs, a village of 40 households, and the Order's hospitable house above the springs. Ethan saw this house from the pass, and the eye immediately gave him 2 pieces of news. One bad and one terrible. The bad news was that a lilac glow hung over the house. The strain was here. The terrifying part was that the glow also hovered over the village. They were a few days too late. People were dying in Kragenvel. The village elder met them at the outskirts with a pike and lowered it when Kalaim identified himself. The elder told his story, wailing and swaying. 10 days ago, strangers had arrived at the guest house. Not warm autumn guests, but harsh and hurried ones. And 3 days later, a plague broke out in the house, and from there it spread to the village through the laundress and the milkman. 30 people had already fallen ill. 9 had died. The Lightbringer had locked himself in his house and was praying. Ethan understood everything before the village head had even finished speaking. The monastery of Vigil did not evacuate all those guilty of going nowhere from before its fire. Someone had come here, to Anselm, to the living library, and brought with them an unfinished lilac death that had broken free. They entered the guest house with the eye and lime. Sick brothers lay in the cells. In the far cell, by the window, a withered old man with a face of wrinkles sat gazing at the mountains. Kalaim called out to him, and the old man turned around. It was Anselm. Alive. Ethan's gaze pierced right through him, and Ethan gasped. The old man's blood glowed with a steady golden light, unlike anything Ethan had ever seen in anyone else. There was not a spark of decay in it. It stood like a wall. 20 years in the cellars had turned his blood into a fortress, and the purple strain was battering that fortress right now because there were traces of contact but no sign of the disease. Anselm listened calmly as they explained why they had come. Then he said he'd been waiting. That for 20 years he'd been a chalice in which his brothers dissolved sins, and that if his blood could now seal what they'd opened with their own hands, then let them take it all. Ethan didn't take it all. He drew the old man's blood in small portions through a hollow needle, and the system, upon receiving the very first portion, rang out like a bell tower. The chain's task was completed. A universal donor sample was obtained. The first-level blood alchemy ability has been unlocked. The bearer can extract a protective essence from the blood of someone who has recovered from an illness and transfer it to a patient. The rate of production depends on the volume and potency of the sample. The potency of the current sample is exceptional. Ethan was working right there in his cell. The ability guided his hands. Anselm's blood settled in Garvin's glass vessels, and alchemy extracted a golden, transparent essence from it, drop by drop. By evening, he had administered the first serum to the village's most gravely ill child. By morning, the child's fever had broken. The lilac glow within his body shrank before the eye's gaze like paper in a fire. It was working. For 3 days, Ethan brought Kragenvel back to its feet. The serum eradicated the strain within a day, and those who lacked the strength were kept alive with elixirs and fluids until it took effect. The village elder followed Ethan everywhere, and on the 3rd day asked in a trembling voice whether it was true that he was the very same woodcarver from the capital mentioned in the decree. Ethan asked which decree. The elder brought a sheet of paper that the abode's heralds had been carrying throughout the northern lands. In the document, the council declared that a plague would be sent wherever a heretic set foot, listing Windhall as the capital, and now it would have included Kragenville. Ethan read it and understood Severin's strategy to the very core. The hierarch had lost the Grain trial and was now writing another book, a book in which Ethan himself was the cause of all the plagues. And this book had an advantage. It was simpler than the truth, and on the fourth night they came for Anselm and Kragenville. Ethan awoke to the cry of a guard. Shadows darted about the guest house. 5 men in the dark, without any white robes, were heading toward the far cell, and they moved with skill. The Baron's guards met them in the passageway, and steel clanged against steel. Ethan was the first to rush into Anselm's cell. The old man stood by the window, gazing at the door as calmly as he had gazed at the mountains. Ethan stood between him and the door, a scalpel in his hand, and felt both ridiculous and terrified. The fight in the passageway ended quickly. 2 of the attackers fled into the night. 3 lay on the ground. The guards lit a lamp, and Ethan examined the men lying there. Under their dark jackets, 2 of them wore waxed robes. On the third man, who was still alive, Ethan found a medallion on his chest with a golden sun and an eye inside. Kel saw the medallion and said in a muffled voice that it was the symbol of the Watchers, the inner circle of the abode of vigilance, those who answered not to the council but personally to the supreme hierarch. The wounded man was dying from a blow to the chest, and Ethan could prolong his life for an hour, and he did. Then he asked one question: "Who sent you?" The dying man looked at him with hatred and something else, with weariness, and said 4 words: "The one who will outlive them all." And he died. They made it by the end of the 4th day. The river did not rise and the axle did not break, but they bypassed the ambush on the southern road via side paths because the Eye of Rot had spotted a lilac spark in the body of one of the beggars they passed, and Ethan ordered them to turn off the road before his mind could grasp why the beggar with the spark was sitting right by the bridge. The school greeted them with the kind of silence that reigns in a house where the hours are counted. March Ta went through the 4th wave. She lay there, transparent in light, no longer writing but dictating, because her fingers could no longer hold the pen. Ethan injected her with the serum from his hand without taking off his travel cloak. Then he sat down beside her and kept his gaze fixed on her blood for 3 hours straight. The golden essence seeped into the lilac like a knife into rotten flesh. By midnight, the wave of heat that was supposed to be the 5th had not come. By morning, Martha asked for some broth and scolded the younger for a poorly scraped table. And from this sign, the school realized that death had retreated. And in the heiress's castle, people laughed for the first time in a week. The serum revived the second sick student within a day. The lilac rot did not affect anyone else in the capital. The Eye kept the city under surveillance, and the city was clean. Ethan slept for 12 hours for the first time in a month, and upon waking, he began to build what he had brought Anselm here for, alive. Rather than a flask of his blood, he set up what he called the Chamber of Blood at the school. Anselm was given warm rooms with windows overlooking the park, and for the first time in his life, the old man lived outside a cell. They drew blood from him in small portions once a week, and alchemy extracted serum from it for storage. But the serum wasn't the main thing. The main thing was what the system revealed at the end of that week, when the count of those saved surpassed 1,000. Second-level blood alchemy could do more than just heal. It could teach. From Anselm's blood, the ability extracted weakened rot, so weak that a healthy body could break it down in a day without any illness, and the blood of that body would form a barrier. Ethan read the description, and his hands trembled. It was a vaccine. He tested it on himself first, then on volunteers from among the senior students. And Ion, who had returned from Windhall with a report, rolled up his sleeve to be the second to be vaccinated. Then on the Baron's guards. Not a single one fell ill, and within a week, the gaze could see a wall in all of their blood. Ethan went to Hilaria and the king with a sheet of calculations. He said he could make the capital a city where the plague would never enter, neither the old plague nor the purple one. It would take time, manpower, and a law. King Aldemar, who had recovered from his illness and grown older but was still alive, listened and asked only one thing. What would the people say about the fact that the carvers were injecting people with the very disease itself? Ethan answered honestly that the people would react with horror, and that is why they must not start with the people. They must start with those whom the people look up to. And the first to offer her arm to the needle in the square before the cathedral, in front of thousands of witnesses, was the heir to the throne, Hilaria. Next came the king, Behind him stood Melchior in the full regalia of the arch-light-bearer. His white cassock on the platform, next to Ethan's doctor's coat, spoke louder to the city than any decree. Behind him were the guild elders, Corvus with his entire guild, and the boatman with his wife, Nisa. The capital went to the needles. Not all of it, and not all at once. But it did. The monastery responded from the pulpits. Preachers shouted that the engravers were branding the flock with the mark of defilement and that the blood of the marked was shut out from the light. Here and there, vaccination stations were pelted with mud. In the Riverside neighborhood, some hysterical woman announced that the vaccinated would give birth to children with rat tails, and Ethan had to station students at the stations who, day after day, showed the crowd their vaccinated arms and their healthy children. The war was fought for every neighborhood, and the school was winning it slowly but surely because it had a simple weapon on its side. The vaccinated did not die, but those who listened to the sermons did. And then Severin made the move that Ethan had been expecting and yet let slip by. The hierarch did not strike the capital. The capital was lost to him, and he realized this before anyone else. He struck where there was no school. In the span of a single month, the purple rot broke out simultaneously in 3 southern cities, in Merivin, in Dolgoy Broad, and in the port city of Saltmire. The second workshop struck in 3 directions at once, and soon after, caravans from the abode entered the infected cities, bearing banners and relics. For the first time in 300 years, the abode's light-bearers carried more than just light. They carried a cure. Calum recognized it from a description he'd heard secondhand, a bitter infusion of a dark root that the brothers distributed to the dying, and the dying would rise again. Severin was distributing the stolen elixir. All these months, his workshop had not only been developing strains, it had been replicating what the system provided to Ethan and what the abode's intelligence unit had extracted from the school's samples and waste. The replica was crude and weak, but it worked on patients in the early stages of the disease. And in the 3 cities of the South, Thanksgiving services were held in the squares to the light, who had shown mercy and healed the plague brought by the heretic. Severin's vision of the world was coming together like a lock. The heretic brings plague. The light lifts the plague. The people of the South fell to their knees before the white robes. Ethan sat over a map of the kingdom and, for the first time ever, felt that he was losing. He couldn't be in 3 cities at once. The school had 1 graduating class of underachievers and 1 Anselm. Severin, on the other hand, had 300 years of networks throughout the country, and now a cure as well. The debate over the man's fate was in full swing, and the man chose his father over the mechanic, just as the old man had promised in court. Ilaria found the answer. She came to the anatomy theater at night, where Ethan was poring over a map, sat down across from him, and said that he was thinking like a doctor when he should be thinking like a ruler. A doctor asks how to cure 3 cities. A ruler asks how to ensure that each city heals itself. She placed her sheet of paper on the table. On the sheet was a decree regarding the Royal Medical Service. The school would cease to be a single castle and become a network. To every city in the kingdom, the crown would send a graduate with the rights of a royal physician, a salary, and the protection of the crown. Each physician will have a vaccination clinic and a supply of serum. Well, the scope of training will triple, and cities are required to send students to the capital's school at the city's expense. But the most important part was the last line on the sheet. The Crown declares that the school's medicine will be provided to everyone free of charge, including the abbey. Ethan read the last line twice and looked at Hilaria. She said calmly that Severin was waging a war based on the idea that light and the knife are enemies, so we must take the war away from him. If the abode wants to distribute the elixir, let it distribute the real powerful one, obtained openly from the school. Every light-bearer holding the school's medicine is a counter-preaching. There's no need to defeat 300 years of the network. We must pour our own blood into this network. Ethan was silent for a long time. Then he said that she had just conceived what his world had been striving toward for centuries, and that he would make 1 amendment. Free medicine must be accompanied by free education. Any brother of the abode may come to the school and study, and Iona will be the first proof of that. The decree was announced a week later. It spread across the country like spring water through its channels. The cities of the South were still holding prayer services, but the first royal physician had already arrived in Merivin with 2 chests of serum and a letter in which the school offered the local abbey medicine and peace. The abbot of Merowan prayed for a week and sought guidance from the cathedral. Upon receiving no clear answer, he accepted the chest, for his city was dying and his caravan's supplies were running out. A month later, the vaccinated city of Merivin stood clean, and the abbot wrote back to the cathedral that he did not understand why a gift of healing should be rejected if it heals. By winter, 11 such letters had been sent to the cathedral from the south. Severin's network began to drink the blood of others and change color from within. That winter, Ethan traveled through the cities visiting the new chambers, and in Dolgoy Brod, a messenger from Melchior found him with an unsealed letter. Melchior wrote that there was a schism in the council, that a third of the archlight bearers secretly supported peace with the school, and another third was wavering. That Severin was old, but kept the council in line through fear and the Watchers, and that the hierarch was preparing his final move for spring. Melchior did not know exactly what that move would be. He knew only that Severin had demanded that all the chronicles concerning the Great Sea, which had existed 300 years prior to the present time, be brought to his residence. That sea from which the Order's power had begun, and that Severin had said one phrase to the elders of the cathedral, which had been relayed to Melchior word for word. That which gave birth to the Order will also save it. Ethan read the letter by the window of his chamber, and outside the window, snow was falling on the pure, saved city. He recalled Anselm's words at the pass. He who outlives everyone never strikes just once. 300 years ago, a certain plague had wiped out half the kingdom, and upon the bones of that plague, the Order of Light was founded. Severin unearthed the chronicles of that plague. Ethan put this together, summoned Anselm and Calum, and asked them a single question. Could there be a 300-year-old rot lurking in the Watcher's cellars? Anselm pondered the question for a full day. Then he came to Ethan himself and spoke for 2 hours, and it was the most terrifying lecture in both of Ethan's lives. The old man explained that in the basements of the Abode of Vigilance, there was a repository the brothers called the Crypt of the First. No one entered it except the senior watcher and, once a year, the hierarch himself. Over the course of 20 years, Anselm had been inside 3 times. When they tested the air in the crypt, he had seen rows of sealed lead coffins, and the oldest ones bore dates from 300 years ago. The brothers whispered that the contents were called the Seed. The legend of the Inner Circle held that the Order's founding fathers had preserved the breath of the great Mora so that the light would never be left without work. Anselm had always considered this a terrifying fairy tale. But the air in the crypt burned his throat. And that was no fairy tale. Ethan asked the most important question. Was the crypt located in the part of the monastery that had burned down? Anselm replied that the crypt was not inside the monastery. The monastery stood above it like a cap. The crypt itself was carved into the rock of the plateau, and fire cannot reach the entrance to the rock. From there, Ethan acted as if he suspected a breach. Quickly and with no room for error. The gaze in the eye couldn't reach hundreds of versts away, so people had to do the work. Baron Redgar received a letter, and his man on the border settled in to watch the roads leading from the plateau.
3 weeks later, news arrived. There was life on the plateau beneath the ruins. Lights were visible at night. Twice a month, a small supply convoy sets out for that location.
And in early spring, a lone rider with well-trained horses left the plateau and headed not south toward the capital, but east, toward Saltmio, to the kingdom's largest port. Ethan stood over the map and saw Severin's plan in its entirety, just as one sees a tumor during an autopsy. 300 years ago, the Great Moor had entered the kingdom by sea through Saltmere. So the chronicles recorded. Severin intended to repeat history to the letter, to release the seed in the port. An ancient rot against which there is neither serum nor vaccine, because Anselm never contracted it, and his blood offers no immunity against it. More will spread from the sea along the highways just as it did 300 years ago, and the Order won't be able to get anywhere in time because it's impossible to be everywhere at once. And then the people will flee to their father, and their father will dig out the old rites from the chronicles, and the Order will rise again from the bones, just as it once did. Severin had no intention of winning the argument about humanity. He intended to recreate a world in which that argument was impossible. Ethan brought everything before the War Council. King Ilaria, Baron Melchior, who had arrived in the capital in secret, and the judge who had presided over the grain trial. He presented the evidence and heard what he feared he would hear. There wasn't enough evidence to strike at the monastery. The fires at the ruins and a single horseman weren't enough. Seizing the hierarch's residence without ironclad proof would mean a religious war. across the entire country, where 2/3 of the parishes still stood behind the cathedral. Severin was untouchable until the very moment the seed emerged from the ark. And after that moment, it would be too late. A solution was found through the collective wisdom of all involved. The king said he could not touch the hierarch, but could close the port. The crown declared a spring quarantine ordinance in Saltmere. All cargo would be inspected, a maritime guard, and the royal port physician with special authority. Ilaria said that the ordinance must be enforced with the eye, and 10 senior apprentices trained in the eye set out for Saltmere disguised as scribes and waymasters. The Baron deployed men to the roads, but Ethan said he would go himself, because the kingdom's sole eye of rot must be stationed where the seed emerges. Melchior remained silent throughout the council, but at the end, he spoke words that brought the room to a hush. He said that everyone judges Severin as a politician, but he must be judged as a man of faith. Severin is sincerely convinced that he is saving souls from the world of machines. A man like that, having released the seed, will not flee from it. He will come close to it, because, according to the Order's tradition, the first hierarch went out to the Great Sea himself and did not fall ill, and this miracle established his authority. Severin will want to repeat the Founder's miracle, to stand amidst the plague unscathed. Melchior said he had known the old man for 40 years. The old man would come to Saltmere in person. Ethan set out for the port in early spring and lived there for a month, working as a waymaster at the southern docks. The eye kept watch over the harbor. The disciples tended the warehouses and markets. The nets were set. At the end of the month, word came from the roads. A horseman from the east rode into Saltmere and vanished into the city. And 3 days later, a white procession of carriages entered the port. Supreme Hierarch Severin arrived to consecrate the new cathedral pier and announced in the square a 3-day prayer service for sailors and travelers. The city rejoiced. Ethan watched the white carriages from his pier and realized that the trap and the bait had switched places. Everyone thought they were catching Severin, but Severin had brought the Founder's miracle to a stage that had been set up, and that stage was all of Saltmere. The blow struck on the second day of the prayers and came not from where everyone was looking. Ethan's gaze was fixed on the harbor, the warehouses, and the water. But a lilac glow streaked with black flared up away from the water, above the hospitable house of the abode near the eastern gate, where beggars and cripples from all over the city had been gathered for the prayer service. They had been fed there for 3 days. Ethan ran through the city and, even as he ran, saw what he did not want to see. The glow was not a patch, but a star. Rays stretched from the house down the streets. The spreaders. The seed had been released into the bowls of soup for the beggars, and the beggars had been scattering throughout the city for a day now. Severin did not need water. He needed his legs. Near the house, Ethan encountered his first victim, and from that single case alone, he understood what he was up against. The old woman was burning and delirious, and black stars were crawling across her skin. The gaze revealed blood disintegrating at a speed Ethan had never seen before. The ancient rot was no faster than the purple one. It was more vicious than anything he knew. Hours, not days. The system activated, and its lines sounded like an alarm. More protocol. An archaic strain of the highest threat level has been detected. No matches found. The elixir is ineffective. The serum is ineffective. Blood alchemy requires a live donor sample with an immune response. Estimated time until an uncontrolled outbreak, 40 hours. Ethan stood amid the unfolding hell and did what his entire life had taught him to do. He worked with what he had. He had sent his students to the resettlement outpost. With a glance, he located everyone who had been feeding in the house. Guards were sealing off neighborhoods in radial patterns. The barracks had been set up in the most hospitable house. The doctor's word had gathered the townspeople in the squares, and Ethan spoke without raising his voice to the entire city. Boil water. Do not go outside. Mark houses with sick people in white. Panic reared up and subsided because the city had been hearing for a year about the carver who stops plagues. But inside the barracks, Ethan was losing. The ancient rot left no survivors from whom alchemy could draw a wall. People were burning to death within 10 to 12 hours. He slowed their deaths with hydration, an elixir, and the hand of restoration. But death laughed at him. By the end of the first day, 40 people had died, and the eye showed sparks in 300 bodies throughout the city. And then what Melchior had predicted came to pass. Severin stepped out onto Saltmere's main square to address the people. He walked through the city in a simple cassock, without an entourage, upright and calm, and people fell to their knees in his wake. He entered the plague-stricken quarter, where even the guards were afraid to go. He entered the barracks. Ethan straightened up as he stood over a dying man and saw the hierarch 3 steps away. Severin looked upon the hell of the barracks without fear, and in his eyes was such genuine sorrow that Ethan felt sick to his stomach. The old man grieved sincerely. He was mourning the sacrifice he himself had made. Severin spoke softly, addressing only Ethan. He said that the carver could arrest him right there and then, and that the carver's guards would take him without resistance, and that tomorrow the entire South and East would rise up in war for the captured saint who had gone out to the sea as the first hierarch, or the carver could acknowledge before the cities that the knife was powerless and ask the light for mercy. And then Severin would show mercy, and the plague would subside. Ethan asked how it would subside. For the first time since they'd met, Severin smiled and said that faith moves mountains. Ethan looked at him with that gaze while he spoke. Ethan looked at Severin for 3 long heartbeats, and in those 3 beats, he calculated everything. Arrest is not an option. War, he couldn't ask for mercy. Severin's mercy would come at such a cost that the school would perish, and the plague would burn itself out as the hearth died down, costing hundreds more lives. There remained a third path that the old man hadn't considered. Severin was sizing up Ethan as a rival for power, but Ethan was a doctor, and what the doctor needed from the hierarch was neither renunciation nor acknowledgement. The doctor needed his blood, 20 drops of blood. Ethan spoke, and his voice was as calm as during his rounds. He said he would accept half the proposal. He would not declare the knife powerless, because that would be a lie, and he does not lie to his patients, but he would publicly ask the hierarch for the light's help for Saltmere. If the hierarch were to provide that help, not in words, but in deeds, let his holiness give his blood to the plague, 20 drops, before witnesses. Ethan said that according to the school's teachings, a barrier lives within the blood of a person who has overcome illness, and this barrier is passed on to the weak, and according to the order's tradition, the first hierarch stood unscathed amidst the great plague. If the same grace flows through the veins of the heirs of the first, then 20 drops of it will halt the plague, and the glory of this miracle will be the glory of the monastery for 300 years to come. He was setting a trap with pure truth, and both of them understood this. Refusing to give blood before witnesses would be a rejection of the miracle and an admission of fear. Consent gave Ethan the key to the seed. Severin was silent, and for the first time ever, Ethan saw this great strategist at a loss, unable to find a way forward. The old man had calculated wars and trials and crowds. He had not calculated that his body itself was both evidence and a cure at once. Finally, Severin said quietly that the carver was smarter than the denunciations written about him suggested, and that he would give his blood. But on one condition, it would not be the carver who took it, but the abbey's physicians who would hand it over to the carver directly, so that no one could say that a heretic had defiled the hierarch's body. Ethan agreed instantly because he saw fear in the condition, not a trick. Severin feared his instruments. He did not understand that for the alchemy of blood, blood itself is sufficient in any pure vessel. The blood was drawn an hour later in the cathedral before 50 witnesses. A healer of the abode cut the hierarch's palm with a silver knife, and 20 drops fell into a crystal chalice, while Severin recited a prayer and the crowd outside the cathedral walls sang. The old man turned this forced move into a spectacle of his own holiness, and Ethan didn't interfere. So be it. The bowl was passed from hand to hand. Ethan carried it off to the barracks as one would carry a grenade. Blood alchemy took the sample, and the system hummed like a beehive. Donor sample accepted. Immune response to archaic strain confirmed. Sample potency is high. Attention! A marker of multiple adaptation has been detected in the sample. The donor was inoculated sequentially at least 9 times over an extended period. Calculation of protective essence production initiated. First dose in 3 hours. 9 times. Ethan stood over the lines and realized he was reading the story of Severin's life, written in his own blood. The old man had been inoculated with the seed 9 times over the course of decades. The hierarch's ritual was not a legend, but a protocol. For 300 years, the order had preserved not only the pathogen, but also a live vaccine within the bodies of its leaders. Knowledge against knowledge. It was just that their knowledge served the authorities, not the people. For 3 hours, Ethan kept the barracks running on the elixir and the hand. 3 hours later, alchemy produced the first golden crimson serum, and he administered it to the girl who had been burning with fever since morning, the girl he had promised to her mother.
By dawn, the girl was asleep, alive, but with a fever that was subsiding. Severin's wall was working against his own seed. Then the assembly line began.
20 drops were enough for alchemy to ramp up production, and each new batch from every new survivor amplified the flow. The first survivors became donors for the next, and the pump spun up with increasing speed. The students were dropping like flies, pricking, administering, and marking the houses. The death rate plateaued on the second day. By the fourth day, it began to decline. By the end of the week, the eye saw 36 smoldering sparks in Saltmire instead of 300, and all those still smoldering lay in the barracks hooked up to the serum. An ancient plague that had wiped out half the country 300 years ago had been vanquished in a single port city in 9 days. The city was in an uproar. People attributed the salvation at once to the miracle of the Holy One's blood and to the engraver's knife, and in this chaos, Ethan did not dispute anything because the chaos played into his hands. As for Severin, he had been holding prayer services all week, awaiting his moment of glory. And on the 10th day, Ethan came to him alone in the cathedral chambers and laid 3 sheets of paper before him. The first sheet was an excerpt from the system, transcribed by Ethan's own hand into plain language, a report on the donor's blood. 9 consecutive vaccinations with an archaic strain, markers dated up to 50 years. The second sheet contained Anselm's testimony regarding the crypt of the first, certified by a judge. The third sheet was blank. Ethan said quietly that the first 2 sheets together meant that the hierarch had known about the seed for decades, had been preparing his body for it, and therefore the plagues were not a punishment, but the craft of the abbey and his own. That these 2 sheets, together with the case regarding the grain, were enough for the council and the crown to burn someone other than Ethan. But there is a third sheet, blank. On it, the hierarch could write 3 things. An abdication from the abode's throne due to old age and infirmity, an order to the watchers to open the crypt before a commission of the crown and the council, and to hand over all the ark coffins for destruction under the eye, and a blessing for peace between the light and the school. Then the first 2 sheets will be placed in the royal vault forever. The people will preserve their miracle in Saltmire. The order will save face and retain its parishes, and Severin will preserve what remains of his life and faith. Ethan said he was not offering this out of mercy. He is a doctor, and he weighs the consequences. A public execution of a saint will spark war, martyrs, and underground crypts for 100 years. A quiet abdication, however, will bring about a dull peace in which children will stop dying from causes they shouldn't have to die from. Boredom is, after all, the goal of all medicine. Severin remained silent for a very long time. Then, without looking up, he asked whether the woodcarver believed in anything at all besides his own mechanisms. Ethan thought for a moment and replied that he did. He believes that a person who holds a dying person's hand is more important than any mechanism. It's just that the hand must not lie. The light of the abode had held people's hands for 300 years and lied to them. Let it hold their hands now and not lie. This work will keep the order busy for another 300 years, and the school won't take it away from him because the school will always lack enough hands. The old man sat motionless, and Ethan suddenly saw with his mind's eye how the old man's heart, which had been steady all his life, began to flutter, and how that old shadow near his heart trembled, and he realized too late that this shadow was not an illness. It was an old scar, the mark of the 9th vaccination that had nearly killed Severin half a century ago when he was being groomed as a young man for the hierarchy. The old man had known the price of the seed firsthand since his youth, and all his life he had paid that price through others. Severin picked up a quill. With a steady, aged hand, he wrote all 3 items at length, signed them, and affixed his ring. Then, without turning around, he said that the engraver was wrong about one thing. People don't want the truth. They want a father. And by the time the engraver realizes this, it will be too late because he himself will become the father along with the system he hides. Ethan took the sheets and, already at the door, replied that this was precisely why he was building a school and not a church. There is no one to replace a father, but a teacher will always be replaced by the next teacher. The renunciation was proclaimed a month later from the pulpits of all the cathedrals. The council of the arch light-bearers elected a new hierarch, and Melchior became that hierarch. As his first act, Melchior confirmed peace with the school and declared the doctrine of invisible decay not to be heresy, but an incompleteness of previous knowledge. The formula was Jesuitical and practical. The crypt of the first ones was opened at the beginning of summer under a commission from the crown from the council and the school. Ethan stood above the lead coffins bearing the eye and watched as, in furnaces of lime and sulfur, a 300-year-old death died, coffin by coffin. Anselm stood beside him and wept openly. The Watchers were disbanded, and 8 of them were brought to trial on charges of the South's destruction. Oswin was among the 8. The second workshop was found based on Crypta's documents in a seaside cave and burned to the ground. Severin left to live out his days in a remote monastery by the northern sea. Ethan watched him go from the city wall, and the system suddenly opened a window he hadn't requested. The Moore Protocol is closed. The threat of mass extinction has been eliminated. The bearer has been awarded the branch's final reward. Ethan read the name of the reward and stood in silence for a long time. The reward was called Legacy, and its description consisted of a single line. Everything the bearer knows can be passed on and preserved without the system. Ethan didn't immediately grasp the meaning of the Legacy Award, but once he did, he couldn't sleep that night. From the very beginning, the system had been a crutch. A glance replaced x-rays and laboratories. Alchemy replaced pharmacology. Painless sleep replaced anesthesiology. A single person with a crutch could save a city, but could not save a country, and certainly could not save a country after his death. Legacy changed the rules of the game. Everything Ethan knew and could do could now be unloaded from his mind into the world once and for all. The ability worked simply and terrifyingly. Ethan placed his hand on a blank sheet of paper, and knowledge poured out on its own in words and drawings from his hand. But at the speed of a printing press, he tested it on anatomy. In a single night, a 400-page atlas emerged from beneath his palm, containing cross-sections and captions that he himself could not have drawn even in a year. The system explained it matter-of-factly. Only what the carrier truly understands is transmitted. Gaps in understanding remain as blank spaces on the page. That was fair. Ethan sat down to draw up a plan for the greatest operation of his life, an operation to transplant medicine from one mind to the entire world. It took 3 years. During those 3 years, the world around the school changed faster than people could get used to it. The Royal Medical Service was established in 40 cities. The second graduating class produced 120 doctors. The third, 200. Martha had studied so well that Ethan entrusted her with all abdominal surgery, and people came from across the sea to watch her operate. Iona headed up what they called the Bridge, a school for the brothers and sisters of the monastery, where the light-bearers were taught to work alongside the scalpel, and in 3 years, 600 light-bearers had passed through the bridge. Melchior proved to be a shrewd and useful hierarch. He quickly realized that the Order of Healing, together with the school, raised more donations than the Order of Cursing, right? And adjusted his preaching to suit the prevailing winds. In the villages, the sun symbol and the school's white sheet of rules for clean water now hung side by side, a juxtaposition that would have been unthinkable a year ago. King Aldemar lived to see his grandson. To the surprise of the entire capital, Ilaria married not a prince, but a young count who, during their matchmaking meeting, managed to hold a conversation about drainage systems. She attended every graduation ceremony, and the people called her the doctor's princess, though she pretended to be angry. She and Ethan argued until they were hoarse over the funding for the service, and both knew that this very argument was the essence of their friendship. Anselm died quietly in his sleep during his second year, in his warm rooms with windows overlooking the park. Ethan's examination found neither disease nor decay in his body. The body had simply run its course. Anselm's blood now lived on in thousands of those he had treated, and Ethan said at his grave that this man had been the kingdom's greatest hospital. Atlases and textbooks flowed from Ethan's pen, volume after volume. Anatomy, surgery, the study of decay, complete with illustrations of pathogens that no one but Ethan had ever seen, and which anyone could now learn. Obstetrics, the study of vaccinations, a guide to clean water for village elders. The capital's printing presses worked 3 shifts a day for the school, and the books were distributed throughout the country and were already making their way overseas. In the third year, something happened that Ethan considered his greatest victory, though almost no one else noticed it. In the town of Dolgi Broad, A local doctor from the second graduating class, acting entirely on his own, without any guidance from the system, relying solely on books and his trained eye, diagnosed an intestinal tumor in a miller, performed surgery, and the miller survived. Ethan was informed of this in a routine official report. He read that report longer than he had once read the decree on heresy. The car drove off without him, and then the system spoke to him one last time. It happened at night in the anatomy theater where it had all begun. Ethan finished the last page of the final volume of the Legacy, and the window opened on its own. The lines were not as they usually were, without counters or awards. The system reported that it had been created for a world where the art of healing had died, and that its mission was as follows: to restore self-sustaining healing. The word self-sustaining was underlined. The system reported that it was recording the completion of the task. School, service, books. The first independent complex case in Dolgoy Brood. Condition fulfilled. The host is given a choice. Option 1. The system remains with the host until the end of his days. His abilities are preserved. Option 2. The system terminates its operations and departs to seek the next deceased world. His abilities fade away within a year. Everything passed down by the legacy remains forever. Ethan sat by the window until dawn. He thought about how, with the gaze, he would be the world's best diagnostician for the rest of his life, and without it, he would simply be a very good surgeon with a phenomenal memory. He thought about the patients whom the gaze could still save, but whom his eyes and hands alone, without the gaze, would fail to help. And then he thought about what Severin had told him as they parted. About a father whom no one could replace. As long as there is a person in the country who can see through the skin, the country will bring the sick to him, rather than learn to see for itself. A crutch that cannot be cast aside becomes a cage. He chose the second option, and the system accepted his choice with a single line. The choice is recorded. Gratitude to the bearer. And it added one more line, the last one in all these years. Of all the bearers in all worlds, you are the first to choose to leave the ranks of the irreplaceable. The window went dark and never opened again. His abilities faded away over the course of a year, just as promised. First, the eye went dark, then the gaze grew faint, then the steel set became ordinary steel that had to be sharpened. Ethan lived through that year as both a farewell and a test. He now operated just like all his students, with his hands, eyes, and mind, and he discovered that the school had taught him the most. Martha assisted him during the last operation he performed with the gaze, and the first one he performed without it, and she said she hadn't noticed any difference. He grumbled that she was flattering her teacher, and he was happy. 7 years later, Ethan stood by the window of the school's great hall and looked out into the courtyard. It was fall. In the courtyard, the 12th graduating class was lining up for the oath, 240 people in white. Martha was administering the oath because Ethan had handed the school over to her 2 years earlier, keeping for himself only the chair of surgery and his Tuesday patient rounds. Among the graduates stood the daughter of that very same Nisa from the boat, and the grandson of the leatherworker's foreman, and 2 guys from Craigenville, and the medical student Tobin, who had become the top student in the course on the science of decay, which was fair in its own way. Parents were crowding at the school gates, and among them Ethan saw women with infants whom those infants hadn't killed during childbirth, and elderly people who had lived to see their grandchildren
because someone had removed that little rotten thing from them in time. Ordinary living people, boring from the Chronicle's perspective, the dream of any medical science.
Ilaria stood next to him by the window. She now ruled the country alongside her elderly father in almost every respect, and came to the school whenever she wanted to remember why she ruled. She asked him what he was thinking about. Ethan thought for a moment and answered honestly. He was thinking about that day in Windhall Square when, hungry and a stranger in this world, he had taken a butcher's knife and plunged it into the pot of soup. Back then, he had been saving a cart driver. He simply couldn't bear to watch a person die from the very treatment meant to cure them. Ilaria said that, by the way, the cart driver was still alive and running his cart service and had grandchildren. Ethan nodded. He knew the coachman sent him a barrel of pickled apples every winter, and it was the most honest payment he'd ever received in either of his lives. In the courtyard, 240 voices repeated after Martha the words of the oath that Ethan himself had once written, taking the essentials from his own world and discarding the superfluous. Do no harm. Do not lie to the sick. Do not abandon the hopeless. Teach anyone who wants to learn. Below these words, in the school's charter, was another line that the graduates did not read aloud, but which everyone knew. A doctor is not irreplaceable, only the craft is irreplaceable. Ethan listened to the oath and thought that somewhere in other worlds, the system was probably finding another hungry stranger in the middle of a foreign square right now. He wished that stranger good luck and good students. The sun hung high and clear over the capital. The air smelled of fallen leaves, and the lie used to scrub the courtyard clean for the oath. Down the street, beyond the fence, a cart rumbled by. Someone laughed, and somewhere a child cried, and all of this was the ordinary noise of a world where people fell ill and recovered, were born and grew old, and very rarely died from causes they shouldn't have. Surgeon Ethan Marsh, once transported by an unknown force from one world to another, stood by the window of his school and was right where he belonged. The story that began with a butcher's knife and a pot of soup ended with 12 graduating classes of doctors and a country where the word curse remained only in fairy tales, which meant it hadn't ended at all. It had simply ceased to need him.